Montana Territory, 1875. The Montana sky stretched like a canvas above the frontier town of Whitewater Creek, a small settlement nestled between rolling plains and the distant promise of mountains. The endless blue seemed to swallow the horizon, unbroken except for a single plume of smoke from the approaching train. Miles Xander leaned against a weathered hitching post, dust clinging to his leather boots as he absently stroked the neck of his chestnut quarter horse. At 25, he had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age, cowhand, trail guide, sometimes bounty hunter when times were lean. "Reckon that train's running late again," he muttered to his horse, Copper. The animal snorted in agreement, shifting its weight as Miles checked his pocket watch. The silver timepiece, one of his few possessions of value, had belonged to his father. It was nearly 5 o'clock, and the Northern Pacific should have arrived an hour ago. Time moved differently in Whitewater Creek, a place where progress and the old frontier collided in fits and starts. The railroad had reached them just 3 years prior, bringing with it a trickle of settlers, merchants, and dreamers, people Miles generally tried to avoid. The West was changing, but Miles Xander had no intention of changing with it. The frontier had taught him one unshakable truth. Attachment was a liability, and in a land where death came swift and often, a man survived by relying on himself alone. He shoved the watch back into his pocket and adjusted his Stetson against the late afternoon sun. His lean frame cast a long shadow across the packed dirt of Main Street as he contemplated the approaching train. He wasn't waiting for anyone in particular, just curious about the newcomers. In a town this small, fresh faces were worth noting, even if only to know who to avoid. Miles had never planned to stay in Whitewater Creek this long. 6 months had stretched into nearly a year as he hired out for odd jobs, breaking horses for the McMaster Ranch, guiding hunting parties into the mountains, and occasionally helping Sheriff Donovan track down horse thieves. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but it was a life, and that was more than many men could claim in these parts. "You still hanging around for that train, Xander?" Sheriff Donovan called from the boardwalk, his graying mustache lifting with his smile. "Just passing time," Miles replied with a shrug. "Thought I might check if any letters came in." It was a half-truth. There was no one who would write to him. His parents were long dead, buried in unmarked graves somewhere in Kansas after a raid during the war. His younger brother had headed to California years ago, and whatever remaining family he might have had scattered to the winds during the conflict that tore the nation apart. "Well, when you're done loitering, stop by the office," Donovan said. "Got word about some cattle rustlers hitting the Simmons place. Might need your tracking skills if they strike again." Miles nodded. Tracking was something he understood. Animals, people, they all left signs if you knew how to read them. It was straightforward work with clear purpose, unlike the messy business of building a life in one place. The distant whistle of the train pulled his attention back to the tracks. The locomotive appeared around the bend, its black iron form belching smoke against the sky as it crawled toward the station. Miles straightened up, unconsciously dusting off his worn denim pants and straightening his cotton shirt. Not that appearances mattered much to him, but old habits from his mother's teachings died hard. As the train screeched to a halt, passengers began to disembark. The usual mix, a traveling salesman with his sample case, a family with wide-eyed children taking in their new surroundings, a few men in business suits likely headed for the mining operations further north. Miles was about to turn away when a flash of blue caught his eye. She stood on the platform, a young woman with honey-blonde hair pinned beneath a modest blue bonnet that matched her travel dress. Even from a distance, Miles could see the confusion on her face as she spoke animatedly to the station master. The older man was shaking his head, gesturing vaguely westward as the woman's shoulders visibly slumped. Miles shouldn't have cared. Whatever troubles this stranger faced were none of his concern. The golden rule of the frontier was simple: mind your own business, survive another day. Yet something held him in place, watching as the train conductor called all aboard, and the woman's head whipped around in alarm. She rushed back to the conductor, speaking quickly, her gloved hands gesturing in what appeared to be growing distress. The conductor merely shrugged, tipping his hat before climbing back aboard. Within minutes, the train was pulling away, leaving the woman standing alone on the platform, a single trunk at her feet and desolation evident in every line of her body. "Damn it," Miles muttered, knowing he should walk away but finding his boots carrying him toward the station instead. It was simple curiosity, he told himself, nothing more. As he approached, he could hear her voice, tinged with an Eastern accent as she continued to question the harried station master. But there must be some mistake. Riversbend is supposed to be a stop on this line. I have the ticket right here. Her voice trembled slightly, though Miles noted she was fighting to maintain her composure. I'm sorry, miss, the station master replied, not sounding particularly sorry at all. Riversbend's 20 miles west, but the train don't stop there no more. Not enough business. Been that way for nigh on 6 months now. Then how am I supposed to? She stopped abruptly as she noticed Miles approaching, straightening her spine and lifting her chin as though preparing for battle. Miles removed his hat as he drew near, a courtesy his mother had drilled into him long ago. Up close, he could see the woman was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 21 or 22, with clear green eyes currently narrowed in suspicion. Her face, though dusty from travel, held a delicate beauty that belonged in the parlors of Boston or New York, not the harsh landscape of Montana territory. Pardon the interruption, Miles said, nodding briefly to the station master before addressing the woman. Couldn't help overhearing you're trying to get to Riversbend. Yes, she replied cautiously. I was told the Northern Pacific makes a stop there, but apparently that information was outdated. The station master snorted. Like I told the lady, the company discontinued that stop months back. Nothing out there but a few struggling homesteads and that failed mining venture. The woman pressed her lips together, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. My brother is expecting me. He has a claim near Riversbend. Miles raised an eyebrow. A mining claim near Riversbend was unlikely to be worth much. The gold rush had largely bypassed that area, leaving behind only the most desperate or deluded prospectors. When's the next train that might get me closer? She asked the station master, who was already walking away. No trains stop any closer, miss, the man called over his shoulder. Stage comes through on Thursdays, might take you part way. Thursdays, her voice rose slightly, but today is Saturday. The station master disappeared into his office, leaving her standing alone with Miles. For a moment she seemed to forget his presence, her shoulders sagging as she stared at the empty tracks. Then collecting herself, she turned to him with forced politeness. Thank you for your concern, sir, but I'll manage. She moved toward her trunk, attempting to lift it despite its obvious weight. I'm heading that direction tomorrow, Miles heard himself say, surprising himself as much as her. I could take you to Riversbend. Her green eyes widened, suspicion evident. You're a stranger, Mr. Xander. Miles Xander, he shifted uncomfortably, already regretting his impulsive offer. I do odd jobs around these parts. Sheriff Donovan can vouch for me if you're concerned. She studied him carefully, from his worn boots to his sun-weathered face. Miles knew what she saw, a frontier man with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much, not the sort of escort a proper Eastern lady would choose. I'm Winifred Fletcher, she finally said. My friends call me Winnie. A pause. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Xander, but I couldn't possibly impose. It's no imposition if I'm already heading that way, he replied, though in truth he had no business in Riversbend. But the choice is yours, Miss Fletcher. Town's got a decent boarding house if you want to wait for the stage. Winnie glanced around at the dusty little town, clearly calculating her options. The sun was already beginning its descent, and Whitewater Creek offered little protection for a woman alone. The boarding house would be safe enough, but 5 days was a long wait, and from the way she kept checking her small coin purse, Miles suspected finances were a concern. My brother is expecting me, she said again, more to herself than to Miles. He'll be worried if I don't arrive. Miles nodded, understanding the predicament. Sheriff's office is just down the street. You can talk to Donovan yourself before deciding. I'm not in the habit of escorting ladies across the territory, but leaving you stranded doesn't sit right either. Surprise flickered across her face, perhaps at his blunt honesty or the unexpected courtesy. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. I would like to speak with the sheriff, she said. If you're truly willing to escort me to Riversbend, Mr. Xander, I would be grateful, but I should exercise due caution. Miles almost smiled at her formal phrasing. That's sensible, Miss Fletcher. Never trust a stranger in these parts without verification. He reached for her trunk. May I? After a slight hesitation, she nodded, and Miles lifted the heavy trunk with ease. They made an odd pair walking down Main Street, the rough-hewn cowboy and the proper Eastern lady, her blue dress already gathering dust at the hem. Sheriff Donovan looked up in surprise when they entered his office, his eyebrows rising at the sight of Miles with a young woman and her luggage. "Sheriff, this is Miss Winifred Fletcher," Miles said without preamble. "She needs to reach Riversbend, but the train doesn't stop there anymore. I offered to escort her tomorrow, but she'd like your assurance I'm not planning to rob or murder her." Donovan choked back a laugh at Miles's bluntness, while Winnie flushed crimson. "I wouldn't have phrased it quite that way," she murmured. "No need to be embarrassed, Miss Fletcher," Donovan said, rising from his desk. "It's wise to be cautious. I can vouch for Xander here. He's helped me track down outlaws on occasion, breaks horses for most of the ranches around here, and hasn't caused any trouble in my town." He gave Miles a considering look. "Can't say I've ever known him to offer escort services, though." "I'm heading that direction anyway," Miles lied smoothly. "Of course you are," Donovan replied, clearly not believing him. To Winnie, he added, "You could do worse for a guide, Miss Fletcher. Xander knows this territory better than most, and despite his rough edges, he's got a decent reputation." "Thank you, Sheriff," Winnie said, her voice regaining some confidence. "I appreciate your candor." She turned to Miles. "If Sheriff Donovan vouches for your character, Mr. Xander, I accept your offer with gratitude." Miles nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with the formalities. "We'll leave at first light. It's a full day's ride." "First light," she repeated, looking momentarily overwhelmed before composing herself. "I'll be ready." As they left the sheriff's office, Miles pointed toward the boarding house across the street. "Mrs. Holloway runs a clean establishment. Tell her I sent you, and she'll give you a fair price for the night." Winnie nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Xander, I should be transparent. My funds are limited. I can pay you for your trouble, but not as much as your service likely warrants." Miles shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not doing this for payment, Miss Fletcher." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Then why are you doing it, Mr. Xander?" It was a fair question, one Miles wasn't entirely sure how to answer. He didn't make a habit of helping strangers, especially ones who complicated his life with their proper manners and questioning green eyes. "Let's just say I've been stranded places I didn't want to be," he finally replied. "I'll come by for you at dawn." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and walked away, wondering what madness had possessed him to saddle himself with an Eastern woman for a day's journey. The frontier was no place for niceties or complications, and Winifred Fletcher looked like both wrapped in a blue travel dress. Yet as he led Copper back to the livery stable, Miles couldn't deny a strange anticipation for the morning. Perhaps it was simply the break in routine, the prospect of a journey with purpose. Or perhaps, though he'd never admit it, it was the prospect of company. Even if that company came with a trunk too heavy for its owner and expectations, likely too refined for the harsh reality of the trail to Riversbend. Dawn broke pale and cold over Whitewater Creek as Miles led his horse and a rented mare to the boarding house. The early morning air carried the scent of wood smoke and dew-dampened dust, the town still slumbering except for a few early risers preparing for the day ahead. Miles had passed a restless night, questioning his impulsive offer and the complications it would bring. 20 miles to Riversbend meant a full day in the saddle, longer if Miss Fletcher proved to be as inexperienced a rider as he suspected. They would need to camp overnight on the return journey, assuming he didn't simply hand her over to her brother and immediately head back. That would be the sensible approach. Get her safely delivered, then return to his solitary existence without lingering. His thoughts were interrupted as the door to the boarding house opened. Winifred Fletcher emerged, and Miles had to suppress a groan. She had changed from her blue travel dress into what appeared to be her idea of appropriate riding attire, a dark green dress with slightly less voluminous skirts, but still entirely impractical for a day's journey on horseback. "Good morning, Mr. Xander," she greeted him, her voice remarkably cheerful for the early hour. Her honey-blonde hair was neatly pinned beneath a small hat, and she wore a light jacket against the morning chill. Despite the improper attire, Miles had to admit she cut a striking figure in the soft dawn light. "Miss Fletcher," he replied with a nod, "I see you're ready for departure." "I am," she confirmed, then glanced at the two horses with a flicker of apprehension. "Though I should confess, I have limited experience riding." My brother always said I would need to learn once I joined him, but Boston offers few opportunities for horsemanship. Miles had expected as much. The mare is gentle enough. We'll take it slow. He gestured to her trunk, which Mrs. Holloway's son had carried out to the porch. We'll need to pack lighter. Can't burden the horses with that much weight for the journey. A flash of dismay crossed her features. But those are all my possessions. I understand, but we can only take what's necessary for now. Mrs. Holloway has agreed to store the trunk until we can arrange proper transport. Once you're settled in Riversbend, your brother can send for the rest. She bit her lower lip, clearly unhappy with this arrangement but practical enough to see the necessity. Very well. Allow me a moment to repack. Miles waited patiently as she opened the trunk and transferred what she deemed essential into a smaller carpet bag. He noticed she included a worn leather-bound book, handling it with particular care before closing the bag. Ready now? He asked when she finally straightened. As ready as circumstances allow, she replied with a determined lift of her chin. Miles secured her carpet bag to his saddle, then turned to help her mount the mare. She was lighter than expected as he lifted her, her hands gripping his shoulders momentarily before settling onto the saddle. The proper side saddle position would make for slower going, but he knew better than to suggest she ride astride like a man. Hold the reins loosely, he instructed, adjusting her grip. Daisy knows to follow Copper, so you needn't worry too much about guiding her. When he nodded, her posture rigid with concentration and perhaps a touch of fear. Miles mounted his own horse with practiced ease, and with a final nod to Mrs. Holloway, who watched from the porch with undisguised curiosity, they set off. The early morning streets of Whitewater Creek were mostly deserted as they rode toward the western edge of town. Miles kept their pace deliberately slow, watching Winnie from the corner of his eye. Despite her inexperience, she seemed determined to maintain her dignity, sitting as straight as her side saddle position allowed. "Your brother," Miles said as they passed the last buildings and the open territory spread before them. "What's his name? I know most folks around Riversbend." "Nathaniel Fletcher," she replied. "Though he often goes by Nate. He came west 2 years ago to stake a mining claim." Miles frowned slightly. The name wasn't familiar, but that wasn't surprising. Men came and went in these parts, chasing dreams of gold or silver or simple escape. "Has he written to you about his success?" Miles asked carefully, not wanting to dampen her spirits if her brother had been feeding her exaggerated tales of prosperity. "His letters were optimistic," Winnie said after a moment's hesitation. "Though infrequent. The last one arrived 3 months ago, inviting me to join him now that he had established a proper home." There was something in her tone that made Miles glance at her more closely. "And you decided to come?" It wasn't quite a question, but she answered nonetheless. "There was little reason to stay in Boston after our parents passed. I had been working as a schoolteacher, but—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "Nate is my only family now, and he promised that Riversbend offered opportunities." Miles nodded, refraining from commenting on what kind of opportunities. A failed mining settlement might offer a refined Boston schoolteacher. The reality would become apparent soon enough. For now, they had a long journey ahead, and dwelling on potential disappointments would serve no purpose. As the sun climbed higher, the April day warmed considerably. The landscape unfolded around them, rolling grasslands giving way to scattered stands of pine and aspen, the distant mountains a hazy purple against the horizon. Miles kept their pace steady but manageable, mindful of Winnie's inexperience, and the horses' need to conserve energy for the full day's journey. By mid-morning, he could see that riding side saddle was taking its toll on her. Though she hadn't complained once, the tension in her posture and the occasional wince when they navigated uneven terrain told him enough. "We'll rest here a while," he announced as they approached a small creek lined with cottonwoods. "Water the horses and stretch our legs." Relief flickered across her face, though she quickly masked it. "If you think it necessary, Mr. Xander." Miles dismounted and secured Copper's reins to a low branch before moving to help Winnie down. Her legs nearly buckled as her feet touched the ground, and he steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "Thank you," she murmured, a flush spreading across her cheeks as she stepped away from his touch. "First long ride is always difficult," Miles said matter-of-factly, pretending not to notice her embarrassment. "Stretch your legs while I check the horses." He busied himself with the animals, giving her privacy to recover her composure. When he glanced back, she had moved to the edge of the creek and was dabbing her face with a handkerchief dipped in the cool water. The sight stirred something unexpected in Miles, a protective instinct he had thought long buried. Winifred Fletcher did not belong in this harsh territory, with its unforgiving landscape and roughened inhabitants. Yet here she was, enduring discomfort without complaint, traveling with a stranger because necessity demanded it. There was a quiet strength beneath her proper exterior that Miles couldn't help but respect. "Are you hungry?" he asked, approaching with his saddlebag. "I've got some jerky and biscuits, not fancy, but it'll keep us going." "That would be welcome, thank you." She accepted the simple fare with genuine gratitude, settling herself on a fallen log with as much dignity as if it were a drawing-room sofa. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the gentle burble of the creek and the occasional nickering of the horses. Miles found himself studying her covertly as she ate. Despite the dust of travel and the strain of the journey, there was a luminous quality to her, a determined hopefulness that seemed at odds with the harshness of their surroundings. "May I ask you something, Mr. Xander?" she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Miles nodded, wary but curious. "You don't strike me as a man who typically offers assistance to stranded travelers. The sheriff seemed quite surprised by your offer." Her green eyes met his directly. "So I wonder, why did you really decide to help me?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most women of his acquaintance, admittedly few, would have accepted his help without probing his motives. But Winifred Fletcher, it seemed, preferred clarity to comfortable pretense. "Honest answer," he said after a moment's consideration, "I'm not entirely sure myself." She continued to regard him steadily, clearly expecting more. Miles sighed, running a hand through his hair. "The West isn't kind to those who find themselves alone and unprepared. I've seen too many good people broken by it." He paused, memories surfacing that he usually kept firmly buried. "Maybe I just didn't want to add another name to that list." Something in his tone must have revealed more than his words, for her expression softened. "You speak as someone who knows that breaking firsthand." It wasn't a question, and Miles didn't treat it as one. He simply shrugged, uncomfortable with her perceptiveness. "We should get moving if we want to reach Riversbend before dark." He rose, effectively ending the conversation, but as he helped her back onto her horse, Winnie spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Mr. Xander, not just for the assistance but for the honesty." Miles nodded curtly, unsettled by the strange connection forming between them. Attachments were dangerous in this territory, a lesson learned through bitter experience. Better to maintain distance, complete this unexpected mission, and return to the solitary existence that had kept him alive thus far. Yet as they continued their journey westward, Miles found himself speaking more than he had in months, pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of knowledge about the territory. Winnie listened attentively, asking intelligent questions and revealing a keen mind behind her proper exterior. By early afternoon, the initial awkwardness had given way to a cautious camaraderie that surprised them both. The sun was beginning its descent when the first signs of trouble appeared on the horizon. Miles noticed the distant plume of dust before Winnie did, his instincts immediately alert. "What is it?" she asked, noting his sudden vigilance. "Riders," he replied tersely, scanning the surrounding terrain, "coming fast from the north." "Is that unusual?" "Could be nothing," he said, though his hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "But in these parts, people usually don't ride that hard unless they're running to something or from something. Neither tends to be good news." He guided them toward a cluster of rocks and stunted pines, providing some cover while affording a view of the approaching riders. As they drew closer, Miles could make out three men, riding hard and seemingly focused on something ahead of them rather than watching their surroundings. "Cattle rustlers, maybe," he murmured, though something about their manner didn't quite fit. They weren't driving any stolen stock, and their trajectory would take them straight toward Riversbend. Winnie shifted nervously on her horse. "Should we wait until they pass?" Miles considered their options. The delay would mean reaching Riversbend after dark, not ideal with an inexperienced rider. But continuing might mean crossing paths with unknown trouble. "We'll give them a few minutes head start," he decided, "then proceed with caution." They waited in silence as the riders disappeared over a rise to the west. When Miles judged it safe, they resumed their journey, though he kept a vigilant eye on the horizon and a hand near his weapon. The afternoon waned as they traveled the increasingly rugged terrain. Winnie bore the discomfort stoically, though Miles could see fatigue etching itself into the lines of her body. The landscape had changed, the open grasslands giving way to more forested areas with rocky outcroppings and hidden valleys. According to his reckoning, they were about 5 miles from Riversbend when he smelled it, the acrid scent of smoke carrying on the breeze. Too much smoke for cooking fires or controlled burning. Miles reined Copper to a halt, scanning the western horizon where a faint haze was now visible. "What's wrong?" Winnie asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Fire," Miles replied grimly. "And it's coming from the direction of Riversbend." Fear flashed across her features. "Nate." "We don't know anything yet," Miles cautioned, even as he calculated their best approach. Could be a controlled burn that got away from someone, but the riders they'd seen earlier now took on a more ominous significance. "We need to hurry," Winnie insisted, straightening in her saddle despite her exhaustion. Miles nodded, knowing she was right but concerned about pushing too hard. "Stay close. The terrain gets trickier from here." They increased their pace as much as safety allowed, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The scent of smoke grew stronger, and soon they could see the dark plume rising against the late afternoon sky. Miles felt his stomach tighten with foreboding. The smoke was too localized for a wildfire, suggesting something more deliberate. As they crested a final ridge, Riversbend came into view below them, or what remained of it. The small settlement, never more than a handful of buildings serving the surrounding homesteads and mining claims, was partially engulfed in flames. Even from a distance, Miles could see figures moving among the burning structures, their actions purposeful rather than panicked. "Oh God," Winnie whispered, her face draining of color. "Nate." Before Miles could stop her, she urged her horse forward, the animal responding to her sudden urgency despite her inexperienced handling. Miles swore under his breath and spurred Copper after her, catching up quickly and seizing her reins. "Not like this," he said firmly. "We don't know what's happening down there, but riding straight in is a good way to get yourself killed." "That's my brother's home," she protested, though her voice trembled with fear rather than anger. "And we'll find him," Miles assured her. "But we do it smart. Those riders we saw earlier, I'd wager they're connected to this. We need to approach carefully." After a moment's struggle with her fear and impatience, Winnie nodded, allowing Miles to lead them on a more cautious descent. He chose a route that kept them partially concealed by trees, approaching from the eastern edge of the settlement where the buildings remained untouched by the fire. As they drew closer, the scene became clearer and grimmer. The general store was fully engulfed, flames licking at the wooden structure with voracious hunger. The small assier's office beside it had partially collapsed, its roof caved in. 3 men, the same riders they'd spotted earlier, Miles was certain, were visible moving between buildings, their intentions clearly destructive rather than helpful. "Raiders," Miles muttered, his jaw tightening. Not an uncommon occurrence in remote settlements, especially those with valuable goods or money. The 3 men were systematically looting whatever buildings remained intact before putting them to the torch. "Where are the townspeople?" Winnie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a good question. Riversbend hadn't been large, but there should have been at least a dozen residents trying to fight the fire or defend their property. The eerie absence of resistance suggested something had happened to them before the burning began. "Stay here," Miles instructed, guiding their horses to a small grove of trees about 100 yards from the nearest building. "Keep low and quiet." "What are you going to do?" Her eyes were wide with fear, but Miles noted she wasn't hysterical, just rightfully terrified. "Going to get closer, see what we're dealing with." He dismounted and checked his revolver. "If anything happens, take Daisy and ride east. Follow our tracks back toward Whitewater Creek." "I can't just leave." "You can and you will," Miles interrupted firmly. "If things go badly, you get yourself to safety." "Promise me." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, though the set of her jaw suggested compliance was far from certain. Miles hoped it wouldn't come to that, hoped this scouting mission would reveal the raiders simply passing through rather than something more sinister. But hope was a luxury rarely afforded on the frontier, and Miles had learned long ago not to depend on it. He moved silently through the underbrush, utilizing skills honed through years of hunting and tracking. As he approached the settlement, details emerged with disturbing clarity. A body lay sprawled outside what appeared to be a small saloon, the man's chest dark with blood. Another figure was slumped against a water trough, clearly dead. Anger coiled in Miles's gut as he continued his reconnaissance. This wasn't simple raiding, it was methodical destruction. The three men were working with practiced efficiency, one keeping watch while the others looted and burned. From his hidden vantage point, Miles could see they were well armed and moving with the confidence of men who expected no resistance. He needed to find out if there were any survivors, and specifically, if Nathaniel Fletcher was among them. But confronting three armed raiders alone was suicide, especially with Winnie to consider. If her brother was alive, Miles needed to locate him without drawing attention. If not, the thought was interrupted by a shout from within the one building that appeared untouched, a small cabin set slightly apart from the others. One of the raiders emerged, dragging a struggling man by the collar of his shirt. The captive was bloodied but fighting, managing to land a solid punch before being struck down with the butt of a rifle. Even from a distance, the family resemblance was unmistakable. The same honey-blonde hair, though darkened with blood and dirt, and similar features to Winnie. This had to be Nathaniel Fletcher. "Where is it, Fletcher?" the raider demanded, his voice carrying in the smoke-laden air. "We know you found it. Tell us where you've hidden it, and maybe we'll let you live." "Go to hell," Nathaniel spat, earning another vicious blow that left him stunned on the ground. The leader of the raiders, a tall man with a distinctive red bandana tied around his neck, approached, looking down at Nathaniel with cold contempt. "Your partner already died for this stubbornness. You want the same." Miles strained to hear Nathaniel's reply, but it was too muffled to make out. Whatever he said earned him a kick to the ribs that left him curled in agony. "Search the cabin again," Red Bandana ordered one of his men. "Tear up the floorboards if you have to. It has to be here somewhere." Miles retreated silently, mind racing. Whatever these men were looking for, they believed Nathaniel had it, and they were willing to kill for it. The situation was far worse than he had anticipated. With only one revolver against three well-armed raiders, direct confrontation wasn't an option. But neither could he leave Nathaniel to die. When he returned to Winnie, her face told him she'd already guessed the worst. "It's bad, isn't it?" she whispered. Miles nodded grimly. "Your brother's alive," he said, watching relief flood her features before continuing. "But he won't be for long unless we help him. Those men are looking for something they think he has. They've already killed others." Winnie pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "What can we do?" "I need to get back to Whitewater Creek for help," Miles said, hating the words even as he spoke them. "Sheriff Donovan and some men could be here by tomorrow morning if they ride hard." "Tomorrow morning will be too late," Winnie said with sudden certainty. "You said it yourself, they'll kill him once they find what they're looking for. Or when they get tired of looking." She was right, and they both knew it. Miles ran a hand through his hair, frustration and desperation warring within him. "I can't take on three armed men alone and expect to win, Miss Fletcher." "Then we need a diversion," she said, surprising him with her quick thinking. "Something to separate them, even the odds." Miles stared at her, seeing past the proper exterior to the steel beneath. "That's dangerous thinking." "More dangerous than doing nothing," she challenged. He couldn't argue with that logic. And truthfully, leaving Nathaniel Fletcher to die while they retreated to safety wasn't something Miles could live with, nor, he suspected, could Winnie. "All right," he conceded, "but we do this my way. No heroics." As dusk settled over the burning settlement, Miles outlined his plan. It was risky, depending heavily on timing and the raiders' reactions, but it was the best chance they had. Winnie listened intently, asking clarifying questions that revealed a sharp mind beneath her initial fear. "You understand your part?" Miles asked when he'd finished explaining. She nodded, her face pale but determined in the fading light. "I understand, but Mr. Xander, Miles, if this goes wrong." "It won't," he interrupted, unwilling to entertain the thought. "But if it does," she persisted, "I want to thank you for trying." Most men would have walked away from this trouble. Miles met her gaze, struck by the quiet courage in her green eyes. "I'm not most men, Miss Fletcher." "No," she agreed softly. "You most certainly are not." As night fell completely, they put their desperate plan into motion, fully aware that the lives of all three of them hung in the precarious balance of chance and courage. The night wrapped around Riversbend like a shroud, the only illumination coming from the smoldering buildings and a thin sliver of moon overhead. Miles moved silently along the eastern edge of the settlement, every sense alert to danger. Behind him, at a safe distance, Winnie waited with both horses, ready for her crucial role in their desperate plan. From his new vantage point, Miles could see the raiders had gathered near Nathaniel's cabin. Two of them sat on upturned crates, passing a bottle between them while the third, red bandana, continued to interrogate Nathaniel, who was now tied to a chair dragged outside. The young prospector's face was badly beaten, but his defiance remained evident even from a distance. Miles checked his revolver one final time, then struck the match. The bundle of dry brush ignited immediately, flames licking hungrily at the kindling. He shoved it against the abandoned shed he'd selected, far enough from the raiders to draw them away, but close enough to demand their attention. Within moments, the weathered wood caught fire, adding another blaze to the night's destruction. Miles retreated quickly to his position behind a water barrel, watching as the raiders noticed the new fire. Red Bandana cursed loudly, pointing toward the rapidly growing blaze. "Mitchell, Jenkins, check that out," he ordered. "Could be someone trying to sneak in under cover of the commotion." The two men rose reluctantly, drawing their weapons as they moved toward the burning shed. Miles tensed, waiting for the right moment. The plan depended on separating the raiders, dealing with them individually rather than as a group. As the two men disappeared around the corner of a building, Miles saw Winnie begin her part of the diversion. She appeared at the edge of the settlement, deliberately making noise as she led the horses forward. Red Bandana's head snapped in her direction, his hand moving to his gun. "Who's there?" he called out, stepping away from Nathaniel toward the unexpected sound. "Hello," Winnie's voice carried clearly in the night air, the perfect mixture of fear and confusion. "Is anyone there?" "I'm lost, my wagon broke down on the trail." It was a risk using her as bait, but they had agreed it was their best chance. Red Bandana's predatory interest was immediately evident as he moved toward her voice, momentarily forgetting his prisoner. "Hello there, ma'am," he called, false concern layering his tone. "You've stumbled into some trouble here. Why don't you come closer where I can see you?" As the raider moved further from Nathaniel, Miles seized his opportunity. He darted from his hiding place, reaching Nathaniel in seconds and pressing a warning finger to his lips before the injured man could react. Nathaniel's eyes widened in recognition, then darted toward where Red Bandana was still distracted by Winnie's voice. Miles worked quickly at the ropes binding Nathaniel to the chair, keeping one eye on the raider's back. The knots were tight, but his knife made short work of them. "My sister," Nathaniel whispered urgently as his hands came free. "She's supposed to arrive." "She's here," Miles murmured back. "That's her voice. Can you walk?" Nathaniel nodded grimly, though pain flashed across his features as he stood. "They killed Hargrove. Burned everything looking for." "Later," Miles cut him off. "Right now we need to move. Head for the trees behind your cabin. She'll meet us there." As Nathaniel slipped away into the shadows, Miles turned his attention to Red Bandana, who was still cautiously approaching Winnie's position. The plan called for Miles to take the leader by surprise once Nathaniel was clear, evening the odds before the other two raiders returned. But plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. A shout from the direction of the burning shed told Miles that the other raiders had discovered his diversion. Red Bandana whirled at the sound, immediately alert to the possibility of a trap. His eyes darted back to the chair where Nathaniel had been tied, finding it empty. "Ambush!" he roared, drawing his revolver and firing blindly toward where Winnie stood. Miles cursed, abandoning stealth for speed. He stepped into the open, his revolver aimed squarely at Red Bandana's back. "Drop it," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of a man prepared to kill. Red Bandana froze, then slowly turned, his own weapon still raised. "Well now," he drawled, eyes narrowing as he assessed Miles. "Looks like Fletcher had friends after all." "I said drop it," Miles repeated, advancing steadily. "Your men are too far away to help you, and I won't ask again." For a tense moment, Miles thought the raider would risk a shot. Then, with deliberate slowness, Red Bandana lowered his gun to the ground. "Don't suppose you tell me who you are?" he asked, a calculating glint in his eye. Someone who objects to murder and arson, Miles replied coldly. On your knees, hands behind your head. Red Bandana complied with exaggerated care. You realize this isn't over, he said conversationally. Even if you kill me, others will come. What Fletcher found is too valuable to ignore. Miles was about to respond when a movement in his peripheral vision warned him of approach. He pivoted just as one of the other raiders rounded the corner, weapon raised. Miles fired first, his shot catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him backward. But the momentary distraction was all Red Bandana needed. The leader lunged for his discarded weapon, coming up firing. Miles felt the bullet tear through his left arm, hot pain blossoming instantly. He staggered but managed to return fire, his shot more accurate than the raiders. Red Bandana jerked as the bullet found his chest, his expression almost comically surprised as he fell. The third raider appeared, took one look at his fallen companions, and fled toward where the horses were tethered. Miles let him go, more concerned with the immediate danger than a retreating enemy. He approached Red Bandana cautiously, kicking the man's revolver away before checking for signs of life. The stillness of death confirmed what he already knew. Clutching his bleeding arm, Miles turned toward the trees where Nathaniel and Winnie should be waiting. The pain was significant but manageable. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone. He'd survived worse. As he reached the edge of the tree line, a soft voice called his name. Winnie emerged from the shadows, her face pale with concern. You're hurt, she gasped, rushing to his side. It's not serious, Miles assured her, though the steadily spreading bloodstain on his sleeve suggested otherwise. Your brother. Here, Nathaniel said weakly, limping forward with one arm clutched around his ribs. Despite his injuries, he moved to Miles's side, supporting him when he swayed slightly. You saved my life, stranger. Miles Xander, Miles introduced himself through gritted teeth, and it seems we're not entirely clear yet. One of them got away. He won't return tonight, Nathaniel predicted. Not alone, but they'll be back eventually. He exchanged a significant look with his sister. We need to move quickly. My cabin's mostly intact. We can tend your wound there and gather what we need before heading out. Miles wanted to question what exactly the raiders had been searching for, what could be valuable enough to justify such violence, but the increasing lightheadedness warned him that his injury needed attention first. He allowed the Fletcher siblings to guide him to the cabin, trying not to lean too heavily on either of them. The interior of the small dwelling had been thoroughly ransacked, furniture overturned and floorboards pried up in places. Winnie immediately set about creating order in the chaos, locating clean cloths and a basin for water while Nathaniel helped Miles to a chair. They were looking for gold, Nathaniel explained unprompted as Winnie began cutting away Miles's bloodied sleeve. But not from my claim. Figured as much, Miles replied, wincing as Winnie cleaned the wound with careful hands. Most claim jumpers don't burn down entire settlements. Nathaniel nodded grimly. My partner, Hargrove, and I found something while exploring an old cave system up in the mountains. Native artifacts, including a map etched in gold that supposedly leads to a cache of Spanish treasure hidden during their explorations centuries ago. And these men learned of it somehow, Miles concluded. Hargrove talked too much when he drank, Nathaniel confirmed. Word spread. 3 days ago, these men arrived demanding we lead them to the cave. When we refused, he gestured to his battered face. Winnie paused in her ministrations, looking between the men with growing understanding. That's why you invited me to come, she said softly to her brother. You needed help. Nathaniel had the grace to look ashamed. I was in over my head, Winnie. Hargrove was killed yesterday when he tried to escape. I managed to hide the map, but they were growing impatient. If you hadn't arrived when you did, you'd be dead and they'd still be searching, Miles finished bluntly. The pain in his arm was making him less diplomatic than usual. I'm sorry for dragging you both into this, Nathaniel said, genuine regret in his voice. But now we need to decide what to do. The surviving raider will bring others. Men like that don't give up easily when treasure is involved. Miles hissed in pain as Winnie began bandaging his arm. Her hands were gentle but firm, wrapping the clean strips of cloth with surprising expertise. Where did you learn to dress wounds? He asked, partly to distract himself from the pain. Boston Women's Medical Auxiliary, she replied with a small smile. I volunteered during my teaching years. Many of our students came from poor families where injuries were common. Another layer of Winifred Fletcher revealed, Miles thought. She continued to surprise him with her competence and adaptability in circumstances that would have reduced many Eastern women to hysterics. "The map," he said, turning back to Nathaniel. "Is it truly as valuable as they believe?" Nathaniel hesitated, glancing at his sister. "Valuable enough that men are willing to kill for it, but whether the treasure actually exists, that I can't say for certain." "Then you have two choices," Miles said pragmatically. "Surrender the map and hope they leave you in peace, or take it and run, stay ahead of them long enough for the law to intervene." "There's a third option," Winnie suggested, securing the end of Miles's bandage. "We find the treasure first." Both men stared at her in surprise. Miles was the first to recover. "That's not what I expected from you, Miss Fletcher." "These men killed my brother's partner and burned an entire settlement to the ground," she replied with unexpected heat. "They shot you and would have killed Nate without hesitation. Why should they profit from such barbarity?" Nathaniel looked at his sister with new respect. The treasure, if it exists, would be substantial. Spanish gold from their explorations, potentially undisturbed for centuries, with that kind of wealth. "We could rebuild," Winnie finished, "not just river spend, but lives. Create something meaningful from this destruction." Miles found himself caught off guard by her passion. This wasn't the same woman he'd met at the train station just a day ago, or perhaps this fire had always been there, hidden beneath proper Boston manners. "It's an appealing thought," he admitted cautiously, "but also dangerous. These men won't be the only ones willing to kill for Spanish gold once word spreads." "Which is why we need to move quickly," Nathaniel insisted. "The cave system is a 2-day ride from here into the mountains. If we leave tonight, we can get a head start." Miles considered their options. Returning to Whitewater Creek was the safest choice, reporting the attack to Sheriff Donovan and letting the law handle the situation. But the surviving raider would reach help before they could, potentially bringing more danger to their trail. And there was a practical problem as well. "We only have 2 horses, he pointed out. Nathaniel smiled grimly. "The raiders left theirs tethered behind the general store. Seems only fair we make use of them, considering." The decision crystallized in Miles's mind with surprising clarity. He had escorted Winnie to Riverspend as promised, his obligation technically fulfilled. The sensible thing would be to see them safely to Whitewater Creek and then continue his solitary existence. Getting involved in treasure hunts and blood feuds was exactly the kind of complication he'd spent years avoiding. Yet as he looked at Winnie, still tending his wound with gentle efficiency, and Nathaniel, battered but unbowed by his ordeal, Miles found himself unable to simply walk away. Something had shifted in the past 24 hours, a door opening to possibilities he had long since dismissed. "If we're doing this," he said finally, "we do it smart, gather only what's essential. We travel light and fast, stay off main trails." The Fletcher siblings exchanged a look of surprised relief, as if they hadn't expected him to agree. "You'll help us?" Nathaniel asked. Miles shrugged his good shoulder. "I'm already shot. Might as well see it through." Winnie's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "Thank you, Miles." The use of his given name shouldn't have affected him as it did, warming something long cold within him. He nodded brusquely, pushing the feeling aside. "Let's get moving. Dawn isn't far off, and we want as much distance as possible before then." As they gathered supplies and prepared for the journey ahead, Miles wondered if he had finally lost his mind. Spanish treasure, vengeful raiders, and a Boston schoolteacher with unexpected depths. None of it fit the careful, solitary existence he had crafted for himself. Yet as they slipped away from the smoldering remains of Riverspend, 3 riders in the darkness heading toward uncertain destiny, Miles found himself strangely at peace with his decision. For better or worse, his path had become entangled with the Fletchers. Where it would lead remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, Miles Xander felt the stirring of something almost forgotten. Hope. Dawn found them high in the foothills, following a narrow game trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. They had ridden through the night, pushing the horses as hard as they dared, determined to put distance between themselves and any pursuers. Miles's wounded arm throbbed with each hoofbeat, but he kept the pain to himself, focusing instead on the trail ahead. Winnie rode beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion but determined. The night's events had stripped away some of her Eastern refinement, leaving behind a more elemental version of herself, hair escaping its pins, dress stained with dirt and Miles's blood, eyes alert despite her fatigue. Nathaniel led the way, his local knowledge proving invaluable as they navigated the increasingly rugged terrain. When the first rays of sunlight spilled over the eastern horizon, Nathaniel finally called a halt beside a small stream fed by mountain snowmelt. "We need to rest the horses," he explained, dismounting stiffly. His injuries from the raiders' beating were clearly paining him, though like Miles, he had made no complaint during their flight. Winnie nearly tumbled from her saddle, her legs buckling as they touched the ground. Miles caught her with his good arm, steadying her until she found her balance. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice rough with fatigue. "I never imagined riding could be so exhausting." "You're doing well for someone who had never been on a horse before yesterday," Miles replied, impressed by her endurance despite himself. They made a hasty camp, caring for the horses before attending to their own needs. Nathaniel produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, meager provisions that nonetheless refreshed them after the night's exertions. As they ate, Miles studied the map that had cost so many lives. It was a remarkable artifact, a thin sheet of hammered gold no larger than his palm, etched with what appeared to be a crude rendering of the surrounding mountain range. Certain features were marked with symbols that meant nothing to Miles, though Nathaniel claimed to understand their significance. "The treasure is supposedly hidden here," Nathaniel explained, pointing to a symbol that resembled a starburst. "In a cave system behind a waterfall. Hargrove and I found this map in another cave about 10 miles northeast of that location. We were planning to mount a proper expedition once we'd gathered supplies." "And instead you invited your sister into danger," Miles observed, unable to keep the disapproval from his voice. Nathaniel had the grace to look ashamed. "I never thought they would find us so quickly. The plan was to secure the treasure and establish a proper home before Winnie arrived." "And yet here we are," Winnie interjected, her tone suggesting she had already forgiven her brother's poor judgment. "What's done is done. We need to focus on what comes next." Miles nodded, respecting her pragmatism. "How certain are you this treasure actually exists?" Nathaniel hesitated. "The map is genuine, native workmanship, centuries old. And there are historical accounts of Spanish expeditions in these mountains losing significant amounts of gold during conflicts with local tribes." He rubbed his bruised jaw. "Whether it remains where indicated undiscovered for all these years, that I can't guarantee." "It's a substantial risk," Miles pointed out, "especially with armed men on our trail." "What would you suggest instead?" Winnie asked, genuine curiosity in her tired eyes. "Return to Whitewater Creek and hope for protection from the law." Miles considered the options. Sheriff Donovan is a good man, but his jurisdiction is limited and he has few deputies. If these raiders have connections, which seems likely given their organization, they could cause trouble even there. "So we either find the treasure or keep running," Nathaniel concluded grimly. "Neither option particularly appealing." "There is another consideration," Winnie said slowly, her gaze distant as if working through a complex problem. "If this treasure is as valuable as suggested, it doesn't just represent wealth. It represents power, the power to rebuild, to create something meaningful." Miles studied her thoughtfully. "You're thinking beyond personal gain." She nodded. Riverspend was a failing settlement, but it needn't have been. With proper investment, schools, infrastructure, protection, it could thrive. The frontier needs stable communities to grow. The idea was startlingly idealistic, yet Miles couldn't dismiss it entirely. He had witnessed the cycle of boom and bust too many times across the West, settlements springing up around mining claims or cattle operations, only to wither when fortunes changed. What Winnie was suggesting was something more sustainable, building for permanence rather than immediate profit. "First we have to survive long enough to find it," he reminded her pragmatically. "And for that, we need rest. I'll take first watch, you two get some sleep." Despite their exhaustion, both Fletchers looked ready to protest. Miles fixed them with a stern look that brooked no argument. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse. 2 hours, then we move on." Reluctantly, they complied, Nathaniel finding a relatively flat spot beneath a pine tree while Winnie settled nearby, using her carpetbag as a makeshift pillow. Within minutes, both were asleep, the events of the past 24 hours finally catching up with them. Miles settled himself against a boulder that offered a clear view of the trail they had ascended, his revolver close at hand. The pain in his arm had settled to a dull throb, manageable if not comfortable. He checked the bandage, pleased to see Winnie's handiwork had held, the bleeding had stopped, and while infection remained a concern, the wound was as clean as could be expected under the circumstances. As the morning sun climbed higher, warming the cool mountain air, Miles found his gaze repeatedly drawn to Winnie's sleeping form. In repose, the strain of recent events smoothed from her features, she looked even younger, vulnerable in a way that stirred his protective instincts. Yet he had witnessed her strength through the night, her refusal to surrender to fear or exhaustion. Winifred Fletcher was a contradiction, Eastern refinement and frontier resilience somehow coexisting in one remarkable woman. Miles tore his gaze away, troubled by the direction of his thoughts. Attachment was a luxury he had denied himself for good reason. The frontier had taught him that harsh lesson years ago when his family's Kansas homestead was raided during the border conflicts. His parents' deaths had been the beginning of his education in frontier justice. His time as a scout during the war had completed it. Survival depended on self-reliance and emotional distance, principles that had served him well until a green-eyed schoolteacher stepped off a train in Whitewater Creek. 2 hours passed without sign of pursuit, and Miles reluctantly woke the Fletchers. Both roused quickly, tension returning to their bodies as sleep fell away. Miles had used the time to study their surroundings and plan their route, consulting the crude map Nathaniel had drawn showing the way to the cave system. "We'll follow this ridge westward," he explained as they ate a hasty breakfast of the remaining jerky. "Keeps us on high ground with good visibility, though the going will be rougher. If we push hard, we might reach the vicinity of the cave system by nightfall." Nathaniel nodded approval. "The map indicates the cave is behind a waterfall on the western face of what locals call Three Sisters Mountain. There's a valley approach that would be easier traveling, but also more obvious," Miles finished. "Better to take the high route, even if it's slower." They broke camp efficiently, erasing signs of their presence before continuing their journey. The day warmed as they traveled, following game trails where possible and forcing their way through underbrush where necessary. The horses struggled on the steeper inclines, requiring them to dismount and lead the animals through particularly difficult stretches. By midday, the exertion had reopened Miles's wound, a fact he attempted to conceal until Winnie noticed the fresh bloodstain on his sleeve. "We need to stop and change that bandage," she insisted, her tone brooking no argument. "We don't have time for," Miles began, but she cut him off with unexpected authority. "If infection sets in, we'll have even less time. 5 minutes now could save your life later." Nathaniel watched this exchange with raised eyebrows, clearly surprised by his sister's forceful demeanor. "She's right, Xander. No sense in pushing until you collapse." Outnumbered, Miles reluctantly agreed to a brief stop. Winnie worked quickly, unwrapping the soiled bandage and inspecting the wound with clinical efficiency. "It's inflamed but not infected yet," she reported, cleaning it with water from their canteen. "You're fortunate the bullet passed through cleanly." Miles watched her work, struck again by the contrast between her refined appearance and practical abilities. "You mentioned volunteering with the medical auxiliary. Was that common for Boston schoolteachers?" A shadow crossed her face. "Not common, no, but after losing our parents to influenza, I wanted to understand more about medicine. Perhaps if I had known then what I know now." She trailed off, focusing on rewrapping his arm. "You couldn't have saved them," Miles said quietly, understanding the burden of such regrets. "Some things are beyond our control." Winnie's hands stilled momentarily, her green eyes meeting his with surprised recognition. "Yes," she agreed softly, though that knowledge rarely eases the pain. The moment stretched between them, a connection formed through shared understanding of loss. Then Nathaniel cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "We should move on," he said, glancing at the sun's position. "Still have a lot of ground to cover before dark." They continued their journey, the terrain growing increasingly challenging as they ascended. The vegetation changed, alpine meadows replacing the denser forest of the lower slopes. Spectacular vistas opened around them, vast expanses of wilderness untouched by human development, rugged peaks rising against the sky like sentinels of stone. Despite the circumstances that had brought them here, Miles found himself appreciating the raw beauty of the landscape. It had been years since he had ventured this high into the mountains, his work generally keeping him in the foothills and valleys where settlements clustered. As afternoon waned, bringing cooler air and longer shadows, Nathaniel pointed to a distinctive formation ahead, 3 rocky spires rising from a shared base. "Three Sisters Mountain," he announced with evident relief. The waterfall should be on the western face, about halfway up. Miles studied the mountain thoughtfully. "We'll need to circle around. Approaching from this angle leaves us too exposed." Nathaniel nodded agreement. "There's a forested approach from the northwest that should provide better cover. We can make camp there tonight and approach the cave at first light." The decision made, they altered their course, descending slightly to reach the tree line that would shield their approach to the mountain. The going was easier among the pines, though the fading light made navigation more challenging. By the time they reached a suitable camping spot, a small clearing sheltered by massive pines with a tiny spring bubbling from the rocks, full darkness had fallen. They made camp by the light of a small, carefully shielded fire, mindful that its glow might be visible to pursuers. Nathaniel produced a small pot from his saddlebag, preparing a simple stew from dried beans and the last of their jerky. The hot meal revived their spirits somewhat, though exhaustion weighed heavily on all three. "How's the arm?" Winnie asked as they finished eating, her concern evident despite her own fatigue. "Manageable," Miles replied honestly. The pain had settled to a persistent ache, and while the wound remained tender, the fresh bandaging had helped. "I'll be able to manage whatever tomorrow brings." Nathaniel studied the golden map by firelight, tracing the etched markings with a fingertip. "According to this, the entrance is concealed behind the waterfall. There should be a narrow ledge allowing access without going through the main flow." "And once inside," Miles asked, "the map shows a series of chambers. The treasure is supposedly in the deepest one, marked by this symbol." He pointed to what appeared to be a crude rendering of a sun or star. "Hargrove and I found references to the sun's chamber in some of the native pictographs in the cave where we discovered the map." Miles frowned thoughtfully. "How many men do you think will be following us?" Nathaniel's expression darkened. "The survivor will have returned to their camp. Likely they have at least 3 or 4 more men waiting. They're part of a larger outfit that operates throughout the territory. So we're potentially facing 5 or 6 armed men," Miles concluded grimly. "Not favorable odds." "But we have advantages they don't," Winnie interjected, surprising both men. "We have the original map, local knowledge through Nate, and most importantly, they don't know exactly where we're headed." Miles nodded, acknowledging her point. "True enough. And we'll have reached the cave before they can catch up, assuming they don't pick up our trail too quickly." "What about after we find the treasure?" Winnie asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. "How do we transport it safely, return to civilization?" It was the central problem. Even if they located the Spanish gold, moving it would be nearly impossible without being overtaken. Miles had been considering options throughout the day, none particularly promising. "There's a trading post about 30 miles southwest of here," Nathaniel suggested, "run by a Frenchman named Beaufort. He has connections with the territorial authorities and occasionally helps transport valuable ore shipments for miners." "Can he be trusted?" Miles asked skeptically. Nathaniel shrugged. "As much as anyone can be when gold is involved. But he has a reputation for honoring his agreements, and he employs enough men to provide reasonable security." It wasn't an ideal solution, but it offered more hope than attempting to transport the treasure themselves with raiders on their trail. Miles nodded slowly. "It's worth considering, assuming we find anything tomorrow." They agreed to set watches through the night, with Miles taking the first shift despite Winnie's protests that he needed rest to heal. As the Fletchers settled near the fire, Miles positioned himself at the edge of the clearing, back against a tree that afforded a view of their backtrail. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the mountain sky. The familiar weight of his revolver against his thigh provided little comfort as Miles contemplated what morning might bring. They were committed now, too far along this path to turn back. Whatever awaited them in the cave behind the waterfall would determine all their fates. Despite his best efforts to maintain vigilance, Miles found his thoughts repeatedly returning to Winnie. In just 2 days, she had demonstrated courage, intelligence, and adaptability far beyond his initial assessment. The proper Boston schoolteacher had revealed depths he hadn't anticipated and awakened feelings he had long since buried. Miles shifted uncomfortably, trying to redirect his thoughts to more practical concerns. Attachment was dangerous, a lesson the frontier had taught him repeatedly and brutally. Yet as he gazed at Winnie's sleeping form across the small clearing, something long dormant stirred within him. A possibility he had denied himself for years, the chance for connection, for a future beyond mere survival. Fool, he muttered to himself, forcing his attention back to the darkened forest around them. Spanish gold and vengeful raiders were dangerous enough without adding misplaced emotions to the mix. Whatever happened in the coming days, Miles determined to remember the central truth that had kept him alive this long. On the frontier, the solitary survived, while those who reached for more often found only heartbreak or death. Yet even as he reaffirmed this belief, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps it was not the whole truth, that perhaps, in the right company, the frontier offered possibilities beyond mere survival. It was a dangerous thought, one Miles attempted to dismiss as the night deepened around their fragile camp. Morning arrived with a thin mist clinging to the pines, diffusing the early sunlight into a soft golden glow. They broke camp quickly, consuming the last of their provisions before setting out toward the western face of Three Sisters Mountain. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they approached, forcing them to leave the horses secured in a small meadow with access to water. "From here we go on foot," Nathaniel explained, studying the mountainside rising before them. "The waterfall is about halfway up, accessible via that game trail." He pointed to a narrow path winding among the rocks. They gathered essential supplies, ropes, Nathaniel's tools, water, and weapons before beginning the ascent. Winnie had abandoned any pretense of Eastern propriety, gathering her skirts and tying them to allow easier movement. Despite her inexperience with such terrain, she tackled the climb with determination, accepting assistance only on the most difficult stretches. As they climbed, the sound of falling water grew louder, eventually revealing itself as a narrow cascade tumbling from a rocky outcropping about 60 feet above their current position. The waterfall was not large, perhaps 15 feet wide, but fell with considerable force into a small pool before continuing down the mountainside as a stream. "The cave entrance should be behind it," Nathaniel said, raising his voice to be heard over the rush of water. "There's supposed to be a ledge that allows access without going through the main flow." Miles studied the waterfall critically, noting how the rock face curved slightly behind the cascade. "I see it," he said, pointing to a darker shadow visible through the curtain of water, "but reaching it won't be simple." The approach to the waterfall was treacherous, wet rocks offering poor footing as they worked their way closer. Miles took the lead, testing each step before allowing the others to follow. His injured arm limited his ability to balance, but he compensated with experience and caution. When they reached the pool at the base of the falls, the challenge became clear. The ledge Nathaniel had mentioned was visible but narrow, barely wide enough for a person to edge along, and accessing it required navigating around the periphery of the cascade without being swept away by the force of the falling water. "I'll go first," Miles decided, handing his revolver to Winnie for safekeeping. "If it's stable, I'll signal for you to follow." Neither Fletcher objected, recognizing his superior experience with such hazards. Miles removed his boots for better grip, then began the precarious journey around the edge of the waterfall. The roar of water filled his ears as spray drenched his clothing. The rock face was slick but offered enough handholds for steady progress. His injured arm protested each movement, but Miles gritted his teeth against the pain, focusing on each careful placement of hands and feet. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only minutes, Miles reached the narrow ledge behind the cascade. The cave entrance was immediately evident, a dark opening in the rock face, large enough for a person to enter comfortably. Miles paused to catch his breath, then turned to signal the Fletchers. Nathaniel came next, displaying surprising agility for a man who had spent recent years prospecting rather than climbing. He joined Miles on the ledge, grinning despite his still visible bruises. "Just as the map indicated," he said with satisfaction, Hargrove would have loved this. They both turned to watch Winnie make the crossing. She moved with deliberate care, her face set in concentration as she followed the path they had taken. When she slipped momentarily, Miles's heart lurched, but she recovered quickly, resuming her progress without panic. When she finally reached the ledge, her face was flushed with exertion and accomplishment. "Remarkable," Miles said with genuine admiration. "You're a natural mountaineer, Miss Fletcher." "Hardly," she replied breathlessly, accepting her brother's steadying hand. But necessity proves a powerful motivator. Together they turned toward the cave entrance. Nathaniel produced a small lantern from his pack, lighting it to reveal a tunnel extending into darkness. The air flowing from the opening was cool and carried an earthy scent, damp stone and mineral deposits. "Stay close," Miles cautioned as they entered. "Caves can be deceptive, easy to become disoriented." The tunnel extended about 20 feet before opening into a larger chamber, its ceiling rising beyond the reach of their lantern light. Stalactites hung like stone icicles, water dripping from their tips to create a constant gentle percussion that echoed through the space. The walls glistened with moisture, minerals creating fantastic patterns and colors where the light touched. "It's beautiful," Winnie whispered, her voice carrying in the natural amphitheater. Nathaniel nodded in agreement but remained focused on their purpose. He consulted the golden map, orienting himself before pointing toward an opening on the far side of the chamber. "That way, according to this, the sun chamber should be the third large space we encounter." They proceeded carefully, Miles taking the lead while Nathaniel guided them according to the map. The cave system proved extensive, with numerous side passages branching from the main route. In places, they had to squeeze through narrow openings. In others, they navigated around pools of crystal-clear water that reflected their lantern light in shimmering patterns. The second chamber was smaller than the first, but contained a remarkable natural formation, a column where stalactite and stalagmite had joined, creating what appeared almost like a carved pillar supporting the ceiling. Nathaniel paused here, examining the walls carefully. "Look," he said, directing the lantern light toward a section of wall, "pictographs." Miles and Winnie approached, seeing the faded red markings that could only be human-made. Crude figures depicted what appeared to be a procession of some kind, human shapes carrying objects toward a central figure. "Ritual offerings, perhaps," Winnie suggested, her voice hushed with reverence for the ancient artists. "How old do you think these are?" "Centuries at least," Nathaniel replied. "Similar to those we found in the cave where the map was discovered." He traced the images with his fingertip, careful not to touch the fragile pigments. "They're showing us the way. See how they all move toward this passage." The continuation of their route was indeed indicated by the pictographs, the procession of figures pointing the way forward. They followed this guidance, passing through another narrow tunnel that descended deeper into the mountain. The air grew cooler, their breath visible in the lantern light as they emerged into the third chamber. All three stopped in astonishment at the sight before them. Unlike the previous spaces, this chamber appeared at least partially shaped by human hands. The natural cave had been expanded and modified, its walls smoothed in places and carved with more elaborate pictographs. But what commanded their attention was the center of the room, where a shaft of natural light penetrated from some opening far above, illuminating a stone platform. "The sun's chamber," Nathaniel breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "Just as described." They approached the platform slowly, their footsteps echoing in the reverent silence. The shaft of light created a perfect circle on the stone surface, a natural spotlight that seemed deliberately aligned. Around the platform, the floor was inlaid with a mosaic of colored stones, creating a pattern resembling a sunburst. "Where's the treasure?" Winnie asked, scanning the chamber. No chests or containers were immediately visible. Nathaniel consulted the golden map again, comparing its markings to their surroundings. "The map indicates, beneath," he knelt, examining the platform more closely. "There must be a way to move this stone." Miles circled the platform, studying its construction. The base appeared solid, but when he ran his hand along one edge, he felt a slight gap. "Here," he called, "I think it slides rather than lifts." Together, he and Nathaniel positioned themselves on opposite sides of the heavy stone. Even with their combined strength, it moved reluctantly, grinding against the cave floor with a sound that echoed ominously through the chamber. Inch by inch, they exposed what lay beneath, a square opening descending into darkness. Nathaniel held the lantern over the revealed space, its light reflecting off objects below. "My God," he whispered. "It's real." They stared in silent awe at what the light revealed: gold. Not raw ore or dust, but worked objects. Plates, cups, small statues, coins, the unmistakable craftsmanship of Spanish colonial artisans. The cache was not enormous, fitting within the space of a large trunk, but its value was beyond calculation, not just in raw worth but in historical significance. "The lost expedition of Coronado," Winnie said softly, her historical knowledge providing context. "These must be artifacts from their northern explorations, hidden either by the Spanish themselves during conflicts with native tribes or taken as plunder and concealed here." Miles whistled softly. No wonder those raiders were willing to burn Riversbend to the ground. He reached down, lifting a small golden goblet from the cache. Its weight was substantial, the craftsmanship exquisite despite centuries of storage. Nathaniel was already removing items, placing them carefully on the cave floor. "We'll need to pack it all securely. Some of these pieces are fragile despite being gold." As they began the process of retrieving the treasure, a distant sound froze them all in place: voices, echoing faintly from the direction they had come. "Raiders," Miles hissed, immediately dousing the lantern. The chamber fell into partial darkness, illuminated only by the natural shaft of light that had given the room its name. "How in hell did they find us so quickly?" "The horses," Nathaniel realized with dismay. "We left them where anyone following our trail would spot them." Miles cursed their oversight, his mind racing through limited options. The cave offered few defensive positions, and they were effectively trapped with only one known exit. His revolver held 6 shots, not enough if the pursuing party was as large as they feared. "Hide the treasure," he ordered in a hushed voice. "Push the platform back in place. Maybe they don't know exactly what they're looking for." Working quickly in the dimmed light, they returned most of the artifacts to their hiding place and struggled to slide the heavy stone platform back into position. It moved grudgingly, the scraping sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet cave. "Now what?" Winnie whispered when they had concealed the cache. "They'll find us eventually." Miles considered their limited options. There must be another way out. "That light has to come from somewhere." He pointed to the shaft of sunlight still illuminating the center of the chamber. Nathaniel nodded in agreement. "Caves this size often have multiple entrances. We need to find it before they reach this chamber." They worked quickly in the semi-darkness, feeling along the walls for any opening or passage they might have missed. The voices grew louder, at least 3 men, possibly more, moving steadily through the cave system toward them. "Here," Winnie called softly from a shadowed corner. "There's an opening, but it's narrow." Miles and Nathaniel joined her, finding a crevice in the rock wall barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Cool air flowed from the opening, suggesting it led somewhere rather than terminating in a dead end. "You go first," Miles told Winnie. "Nathaniel follows, I'll come last." When she hesitated, he added firmly, "No arguments. If they reach this chamber before we're clear, someone needs to slow them down." Understanding his intention, Winnie clasped his arm briefly. "Don't play the hero, Mr. Xander." "Follow quickly." Miles nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The connection between them had deepened in ways he hadn't anticipated, making the prospect of sacrifice both more meaningful and more painful. Winnie disappeared into the crevice, followed moments later by Nathaniel. Miles waited until they were both out of sight before drawing his revolver and taking position where he could observe the entrance to the chamber. The raiders' voices grew clearer. They had reached the second cave and discovered the pictographs, judging by their excited comments. Miles took a deep breath, steadying himself for what might come. He had no intention of dying here if it could be avoided, but ensuring the Fletchers' escape took priority. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of believing attachment was weakness, he now found himself willing to risk everything for people he had known less than 3 days. The first raider appeared at the chamber entrance, a burly man with a week's growth of beard, revolver in hand. He paused, eyes widening as he took in the sunlit chamber. 2 more men followed close behind, spreading out as they entered the space. "This is it," the first man declared, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "The Sun's chamber, just like Fletcher described under Persuasion." Miles felt a surge of anger at this confirmation of Nathaniel's torture, but he remained motionless in the shadows, counting heartbeats. Just 3 raiders, better odds than he had feared, though still dangerous. "Where's the gold?" one of the others demanded, scanning the room with obvious disappointment at finding no obvious treasure. "Fletcher said it was hidden," the leader replied, approaching the stone platform. "Something about a moving stone." He ran his hand along the edge where Miles and Nathaniel had slid it earlier, finding the slight gap. "Here. Help me with this." As the 3 men positioned themselves around the platform, Miles made his decision. He could either attempt to eliminate the threat now, or use their distraction to make his own escape. The former was risky with only 6 bullets against 3 armed men. The latter meant abandoning the treasure they had worked so hard to find. The decision was made for him when one of the raiders glanced up, catching sight of his movement in the shadows. "Someone's here," the man shouted, raising his weapon. Miles fired first, his shot catching the raider in the shoulder and spinning him backward. The other 2 reacted instantly, diving for cover behind the stone platform as they returned fire. The confined space amplified the gunshots to deafening levels, the flashes momentarily blinding in the dim chamber. Using the momentary confusion, Miles retreated toward the crevice, firing twice more to keep the raiders pinned down. A bullet splintered stone inches from his head as he reached the narrow opening, reminding him of the precarious nature of his position. "He's getting away," one of the raiders shouted. "After him." Miles squeezed through the crevice just as another bullet struck the rock where he had been standing. The passage beyond was narrow but navigable, illuminated faintly by light filtering from ahead. He moved as quickly as the confined space allowed, aware of pursuit behind him. The passage twisted and turned, occasionally opening enough to allow faster movement before narrowing again to require sideways progress. Miles had no idea if he was following the Fletchers or if the passage had branched, separating them. His injured arm scraped painfully against the rock walls as he hurried forward, guided only by the gradually increasing light. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only minutes, Miles emerged onto a narrow ledge on the mountainside, a natural balcony about 30 feet below the summit of Three Sisters Mountain. The vista was breathtaking, miles of wilderness spreading to the horizon, but he had no time to appreciate it. A quick scan revealed no sign of the Fletchers, suggesting they had either taken a different route or moved on already. The sound of pursuit from the passage spurred Miles to action. The ledge extended around the curve of the mountain, possibly leading to another way down. He moved quickly along it, searching for any sign of his companions while remaining alert for danger from behind. A shout from above drew his attention. Looking up, he spotted Winnie and Nathaniel on a similar ledge about 20 feet higher on the mountainside. They had found a different exit from the cave system and were gesturing urgently for him to join them. The climb looked challenging but manageable, a series of natural handholds in the rock face that would allow him to reach their position. Miles holstered his revolver and began the ascent, ignoring the protest from his injured arm as he pulled himself upward. He was halfway to their position when the first raider emerged onto the ledge below. The man spotted him immediately, raising his weapon. Miles clung to the rock face, exposed and vulnerable as the raider took aim. A shot rang out, but not from below. Nathaniel had drawn his own weapon and fired at the raider, forcing the man to seek cover rather than take careful aim at Miles. This brief respite allowed Miles to continue his climb, reaching the upper ledge moments later with Winnie's assistance. 3 of them, he reported breathlessly as they retreated from the exposed edge. They found the chamber but not the treasure yet. "There's a way down on this side," Nathaniel explained, leading them along the ledge. "Steep but manageable. It should take us back to where we left the horses." The descent proved as challenging as Nathaniel had suggested, a natural chimney in the rock that required careful navigation. Winnie went first, followed by her brother, with Miles bringing up the rear to provide covering fire if the raiders found their route. His wounded arm made the climb down particularly difficult, forcing him to rely more on his legs for control. When they finally reached the base of the mountain, all 3 were breathing hard from exertion and tension. The meadow where they had left their horses was visible through the trees about a quarter-mile away. "We need to move quickly," Miles urged. "Once they realize we've escaped, they'll head for the horses too." They made their way through the forest as rapidly as safety allowed. alert for any sign the raiders had found another, faster route down the mountain. The meadow appeared undisturbed when they reached it, the three horses grazing peacefully where they had been left. "What now?" Winnie asked as they reached the animals. "The treasure is still in the cave." "And the raiders will have found it by now," Nathaniel added grimly. "All this for nothing." Miles shook his head, a smile spreading across his face despite their predicament. "Not for nothing." He reached into his jacket, producing the small golden goblet he had pocketed before they concealed the rest of the treasure. "I took this as insurance, proof the treasure exists." The Fletchers stared at the artifact in astonishment. "You brilliant man," Winnie breathed, her eyes lighting with new hope. "One piece won't make us rich," Nathaniel pointed out, "but it's evidence enough to interest the territorial authorities, with official backing." "We could return with enough men to secure the cave properly," Miles finished. "But first we need to reach safety. Those raiders won't give up easily." They mounted quickly, orienting themselves toward the southwest, where Nathaniel had mentioned the trading post. It offered their best chance of finding help and communicating with authorities before the raiders could consolidate their position at the cave. As they urged the horses into motion, Miles found himself riding beside Winnie. Despite the danger still facing them, he felt a surprising sense of optimism, not just about their chances of eventually recovering the treasure, but about possibilities he had long since dismissed from his life. "That was quick thinking," she said, nodding toward the pocket where he had stowed the golden goblet, "taking a piece as evidence." "Insurance," Miles corrected with a small smile. "In my experience, it's wise to have something tangible when making extraordinary claims." Winnie studied him thoughtfully. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Xander. For someone who presents himself as a simple cowboy, you demonstrate remarkable foresight." "The frontier teaches adaptability," he replied, suddenly uncomfortable under her perceptive gaze. "Or it teaches harsh lessons to those who can't adapt." "And which has it taught you?" she asked, her question cutting to the heart of what Miles had been avoiding confronting. Before he could formulate a response, Nathaniel called from ahead, pointing to rising dust on the horizon behind them. "Riders coming, moving fast." The brief moment of connection between Miles and Winnie dissolved as they focused on the immediate threat. The raiders had indeed found another route down the mountain and were now in pursuit. "How far to the trading post?" Miles asked, calculating their options. "At least 15 miles, Nathaniel replied grimly. "Too far to outrun them on these tired horses." Miles made a rapid assessment of their situation. Open ground offered speed but left them exposed. Forest provided cover but would slow their progress. The raiders had fresher mounts and likely knew the territory as well as Nathaniel did. "We need to split up," he decided, the words bitter in his mouth even as he recognized their necessity. "They're after the proof of the treasure. I'll draw them off while you two make for the trading post." Predictably, both Fletchers immediately objected. "Absolutely not," Winnie declared with surprising vehemence. "We're not separating." "She's right," Nathaniel added. "Together we at least have a fighting chance. Alone, none of us would survive an encounter with those men." Miles wanted to argue, but recognized the truth in their assessment. The raiders would likely split their forces if the group separated, hunting each of them down individually. Together, they at least had the advantage of multiple defenders. "The river," Nathaniel suggested suddenly. "It's about 3 miles east. If we can reach it and follow it downstream, we might lose them. The current's strong this time of year with snowmelt." It was a desperate plan, but better than a straight chase they couldn't win. With silent agreement, they altered course, pushing their tired horses toward the east where the land sloped gradually downward toward the river valley. The pursuing riders gained ground steadily despite their efforts. When Miles glanced back, he could make out 4 men, the 3 from the cave plus another who must have been waiting with the horses. Their greater numbers and fresher mounts made the outcome of a sustained chase inevitable. The sound of flowing water reached them before the river came into view, a substantial watercourse swollen with spring runoff, racing between rocky banks with considerable force. They reined in at the edge, confronted with a new challenge. The river was too swift and deep to cross safely on horseback, its turbulent surface broken by partially submerged rocks and swirling eddies. "Downstream," Nathaniel directed, pointing to where the river curved around a stand of cottonwoods. There's a trading ford about a mile down, used by trappers in drier seasons. It might be passable. They followed the riverbank at a cautious trot, the ground becoming increasingly muddy and treacherous. Behind them, the pursuing riders appeared at the top of the slope, raising a shout when they spotted their quarry. A shot rang out, the bullet striking a tree beside them. The raiders were still too distant for accurate fire, but the message was clear: they would not escape without a fight. The ford, when they reached it, proved more challenging than Nathaniel had hoped. The spring runoff had raised the water level considerably, leaving only the tops of the largest crossing stones visible above the churning surface. "We can't cross here," Winnie said, eyeing the turbulent water with justified concern. "The horses would be swept away." Miles scanned their surroundings, searching for alternatives. The pursuers were closing rapidly, no more than a half-mile behind now. Continuing along the riverbank would only delay the inevitable confrontation. His gaze settled on a large fallen cottonwood spanning about 3/4 of the river's width. It had been uprooted during some previous flood, its massive trunk creating a natural bridge that extended most of the way across the watercourse. "There," he pointed. "We go on foot, cross on the trunk, swim the last section. Leave the horses, they'll slow the raiders down while they decide whether to follow us or try to catch the animals." It was a desperate plan with considerable risks, but their options were rapidly diminishing. The Fletchers recognized this as well, dismounting without argument and gathering what essential supplies they could carry: weapons, the golden goblet, and Nathaniel's map. They reached the fallen tree just as the raiders crested the final rise, bringing them into clear view. Miles urged the Fletchers onto the trunk first, following behind with his revolver ready to provide covering fire if necessary. The crossing was precarious, the bark slick with spray from the river below. Winnie moved with careful determination, her skirts hampering her progress but her balance remarkably sure. Nathaniel followed closely, occasionally steadying his sister when the trunk narrowed or twisted. Miles backed along the makeshift bridge, keeping his attention divided between his footing and the approaching raiders. They had reached the abandoned horses and appeared to be arguing about how to proceed, whether to attempt the same crossing or seek another route. When they reached the end of the trunk, approximately 10 feet of turbulent water remained between them and the far shore. Nathaniel went first, sliding into the current and swimming powerfully toward the bank. Despite the river's force, he reached the opposite side quickly, pulling himself onto land before turning to assist Winnie. "Can you swim?" Miles asked her as they prepared for the final leg of their crossing. "Adequately," she replied, eyeing the churning water with understandable apprehension. "I'll be right behind you," he promised. "The current will push you downstream, aim for that outcropping where your brother is waiting." Winnie nodded, gathering her courage before sliding into the frigid water. The current immediately caught her, pulling her downstream faster than she could swim across. For a heart-stopping moment, Miles thought she might be swept away, but she fought the river with unexpected strength, angling toward where Nathaniel waited. Her brother extended a branch, which she grasped firmly, allowing him to pull her to safety. A shout from behind warned Miles that the raiders had made their decision. 2 had dismounted and were approaching the fallen tree, while the others apparently intended to search for another crossing. Miles holstered his revolver to keep it dry, then lowered himself into the rushing water. The cold was shocking, instantly numbing his wounded arm and stealing his breath. The current seized him immediately, its force far greater than he had anticipated. He struck out toward the bank where the Fletchers waited, fighting both the river and his own increasingly unresponsive limbs. A shot rang out, the bullet striking water nearby. One of the raiders had reached a position where he could fire across the river. Miles redoubled his efforts, aware that each passing second increased the danger not just from drowning but from gunfire. His injured arm failed him entirely, leaving him to swim one-handed against the powerful current. He was being swept downstream rapidly, the spot where the Fletchers waited already passing by. Ahead, the river curved sharply around a rocky outcropping, the water churning into white foam as it negotiated the obstacle. Miles fought to angle toward the shore, knowing if he was carried around that bend, his chances of survival would diminish dramatically. His strength was ebbing, the cold water sapping his energy with merciless efficiency. A branch appeared before him, extended by Nathaniel, who had run downstream to intercept him. Miles grasped it with his good hand, feeling the Fletcher's strength as he was pulled gradually toward the shore. When his feet finally touched bottom, relief flooded through him, quickly followed by alarm as more shots rang out from across the river. "Move," he gasped, pushing Nathaniel toward the cover of the trees as bullets struck the water and shore around them. They scrambled up the muddy bank, ducking low as they reached the tree line where Winnie waited. Together, they plunged into the forest, putting distance between themselves and the river, where the raiders were now attempting their own crossing. The wet clothes clung to them, making movement difficult and increasing the risk of exposure as the day waned toward evening. But survival demanded they keep moving, finding both distance from their pursuers and shelter from the approaching night. They traveled for nearly an hour, following game trails deeper into the forest. When they finally paused to rest, it was in a dense thicket that offered concealment from both pursuit and the increasing chill of the mountain evening. "We need fire," Nathaniel said, noting how all three were shivering in their wet clothing. "The risk of exposure is greater than the risk of detection at this point." Miles nodded agreement, too exhausted to argue even if he had disagreed. His injured arm had gone from painful to alarmingly numb, and the exertions of the day had drained what reserves of strength remained. While Nathaniel gathered dry wood from beneath fallen logs and overhangs, Winnie assessed Miles's condition with concern. "Your wound has reopened," she observed, gently examining his arm once he removed his sodden jacket. "And you're showing signs of exposure." "I've endured worse," Miles replied, though in truth he couldn't immediately recall when. "That's not reassuring," she chided gently. "Your body can only withstand so much, regardless of your frontier stoicism." Nathaniel returned with an armful of relatively dry wood and kindling, constructing a small fire in the shelter of a rocky outcropping that would help contain and direct the smoke upward rather than outward. Once the flames caught, the immediate relief of warmth was profound, though their wet clothing continued to leach heat from their bodies. "We should take turns keeping watch," Miles suggested, fighting the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I'll take first." "You'll rest," Winnie interrupted firmly. "Nate and I will manage the watches. You need to recover your strength." Under normal circumstances, Miles might have resisted such direction, but the events of the past days, the gunshot wound, the cave exploration, the desperate river crossing, had depleted him beyond argument. He nodded reluctantly, settling closer to the fire as Winnie rebandaged his arm with strips torn from her petticoat. As darkness settled over the forest, bringing with it the myriad sounds of nocturnal creatures, Miles found himself drifting between consciousness and sleep. The golden goblet rested beside him, its presence a tangible reminder of what they had risked so much to find, and what remained hidden in the cave behind the waterfall. Through half-closed eyes, he watched Winnie and Nathaniel conferring quietly across the fire. Their resemblance was striking in the flickering light, the same determined set to their jaws, the same intelligent eyes. Yet there were differences too, beyond the obvious ones of gender. Where Nathaniel's experiences had hardened him, given him an edge of cynicism, Winnie retained something Miles had long since lost, a belief in possibilities beyond mere survival. As sleep finally claimed him, Miles wondered if perhaps that belief was contagious. For the first time in years, he found himself contemplating a future that involved more than simply enduring until the inevitable end. It was a dangerous thought, born perhaps of exhaustion and the strange intimacy forced upon them by shared danger. Yet it persisted as consciousness faded, a small flame of possibility that refused to be extinguished by the cold pragmatism that had governed his existence for so long. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the forest canopy and the distant call of birds announcing the new day. Miles woke to find Winnie seated beside him, her face showing signs of fatigue but her eyes alert as she maintained her watch. She had removed her outer dress to dry by the fire, sitting now in her chemise and petticoat with remarkable unconcern for propriety. "You should have woken me for a watch," Miles said, his voice rough from sleep and the previous day's exertions. "You needed the rest more than we needed another sentry," she replied simply. "How's the arm?" Miles flexed it experimentally, finding the pain present but manageable. The numbness had receded, which he took as a positive sign. "Functional, where's your brother?" "Scouting our route forward. We need to determine if the raiders are still searching for us or if they've returned to the cave." She offered him a small handful of berries she had gathered during her watch. It's not much, but it's something. Miles accepted them gratefully, suddenly aware of his hunger. They ate in companionable silence as the forest awakened around them, each lost in their own thoughts. Their clothing had dried somewhat overnight, though Miles's boots remained unpleasantly damp. "What will you do?" Winnie asked suddenly, "after we reach safety and alert the authorities about the treasure?" The question caught Miles off guard. He had been focused so intently on immediate survival that longer-term considerations had remained unexamined. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "No," her smile was gently challenging. A man who takes a golden goblet as insurance clearly thinks beyond the immediate moment. Miles conceded the point with a small nod. "Fair enough. I suppose it depends on what happens with the treasure. If it's recovered successfully, the territorial government will likely claim a significant portion, but as discoverers, you and your brother would be entitled to a reward." "And you as well," she pointed out. "Without your assistance, we wouldn't have found it at all, and certainly wouldn't have escaped with proof of its existence." The implication of potential wealth sat uncomfortably with Miles. Throughout his years on the frontier, he had pursued sufficiency rather than riches, taking jobs that provided for immediate needs rather than building toward any particular future. "I've never been much for planning," he said finally. "The frontier teaches you to take each day as it comes." Winnie studied him thoughtfully. "Or perhaps it's easier to avoid disappointment by refusing to hope for anything beyond survival." The observation struck uncomfortably close to truths Miles preferred not to examine. Before he could formulate a response, Nathaniel returned, his expression grim. "They're still searching," he reported without preamble. "2 men on this side of the river, moving in a search pattern. The others have either returned to the cave or are searching elsewhere." Miles rose, wincing slightly as various muscles protested the previous day's abuse. "How far to the trading post from here?" Nathaniel considered. "About 10 miles southwest. Difficult terrain, but manageable in a day if we push hard." "And if we reach it," Winnie asked, "what then?" "Beaufort, the Frenchman who runs it, has connections with the territorial marshal's office," Nathaniel explained. "With the goblet as evidence and our testimony about the raiders' actions at Riversbend, we should be able to secure official assistance." The plan was reasonable, but depended on reaching the trading post undetected by the men hunting them. Without horses, traveling 10 miles through rugged terrain would be challenging under the best circumstances. With pursuers actively searching and their own physical condition compromised by recent events, the odds were concerning. "We should move now," Miles decided. "While we still have most of the day ahead of us, stay off ridgelines where we'd be visible, follow game trails where possible." They gathered their meager possessions, weapons, the precious goblet, Nathaniel's maps, and extinguished the fire completely, scattering the ashes to eliminate obvious signs of their presence. Miles took the goblet, securing it inside his shirt where it rested cool against his skin, a constant reminder of what they had found and what remained to be secured. The day that followed tested their endurance to its limits. The terrain was unforgiving, steep slopes alternating with rocky plateaus. Dense underbrush giving way to exposed meadows they were forced to circle rather than cross directly. They ate what they could find along the way, berries, a few edible roots Nathaniel identified, even some pine nuts from a stand of pinyon trees. By mid-afternoon, fatigue had become their constant companion. Miles's injured arm throbbed with each step, and both Fletchers showed signs of exhaustion, stumbling occasionally on uneven ground, their breathing labored during climbs. Yet they pressed on with remarkable determination, understanding that safety lay in reaching the trading post before nightfall. The sun was low on the horizon when they finally crested a ridge and spotted their destination in the valley below, a collection of log buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade, thin columns of smoke rising from several chimneys. The trading post was larger than Miles had expected, almost a small settlement in its own right. "Beaufort's place," Nathaniel confirmed, relief evident in his voice. "We made it." But their relief was premature. As they prepared to descend toward the trading post, movement in the forest below caught Miles's attention, 2 riders following the trail that led to the settlement's gates. Even from a distance, he recognized the distinctive red bandana of the leader they had encountered at the cave. Raiders, he warned, pulling the Fletchers back from the exposed ridgeline. They've beaten us here. Nathaniel swore softly. They must have guessed our destination, if they reach Beaufort first and spin their own story. The implication was clear. Arriving at the trading post claiming to be victims of robbery would be far less convincing if the supposed robbers had already established themselves as legitimate visitors. "What do we do now?" Winnie asked, her voice steady despite the setback. Miles considered their limited options. Night was approaching, and they were exhausted, hungry, and ill-equipped for another day in the wilderness. Yet entering the trading post with raiders already risked immediate confrontation, or worse, arrest if the raiders had successfully portrayed themselves as the wronged party. "We wait until dark," he decided finally. "Approach cautiously and assess the situation before revealing ourselves. If necessary, we can try to speak with Beaufort privately." The plan was far from ideal, but it offered their best chance of reaching safety without walking directly into an ambush. They retreated from the ridge to a sheltered position where they could rest while maintaining observation of the trading post below. As twilight deepened into full darkness, they watched the trading post come alive with lamplight, illuminating windows and casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with their cold, hungry state on the hillside above. The gates remained open, suggesting the trading post welcomed evening visitors, travelers arriving late or locals coming to trade or socialize. "There's a back entrance," Nathaniel explained as they prepared to make their approach. "Used primarily for deliveries and by Beaufort's workers. If we can reach it unobserved, we might be able to find someone to take a message to Beaufort." They descended carefully in the darkness, using the cover of trees until they reached the cleared area surrounding the palisade. The main gates faced west, but Nathaniel led them around to the southern side where a smaller gate was visible, currently closed but not apparently guarded. As they approached this secondary entrance, a dog began barking inside the compound, alerting those within to their presence. Miles cursed softly, their element of surprise evaporating with each sharp bark. "No choice now," he muttered. "We make our case directly." Before they could reach the gate, it swung open, revealing a burly man with a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other. "Who goes there?" he demanded, raising the light to illuminate the bedraggled trio. "Friends," Nathaniel called, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "We need to speak with Beaufort urgently." The man studied them suspiciously, taking in their disheveled appearance and obvious exhaustion. "State your business." "Tell him Nathaniel Fletcher needs his help. It's a matter of life and death and substantial profit." The mention of profit seemed to register with the gatekeeper. After a moment's consideration, he lowered the shotgun slightly. "Wait here," he instructed, disappearing back through the gate but leaving it ajar. They stood in tense silence, aware that their position was vulnerable if the raiders learned of their arrival. Minutes stretched interminably before the gate opened again, revealing a different figure, tall and lean, with a neatly trimmed beard and the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. "I am Jacques Beaufort," he announced in a voice carrying the faint accent of his French heritage. "You claim urgent business with me, Monsieur Fletcher." Nathaniel stepped forward. "We need your help, Beaufort. Raiders attacked Riversbend, killed my partner, and pursued us into the mountains. They're after something we discovered, something of significant historical and monetary value." Beaufort's expression remained carefully neutral. "An interesting claim. Particularly as I have guests who tell a different story, of being attacked while legally prospecting, and pursuing the thieves who stole their property." Miles felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. As they had feared, the raiders had reached Beaufort first and established their own narrative. The trader was clearly skeptical of their counterclaim. "They're lying," Winnie interjected, her voice carrying quiet authority despite her bedraggled appearance. "These men burned an entire settlement to the ground. They shot Mr. Xander here and would have killed my brother if we hadn't escaped." Beaufort's gaze shifted to Winnie, assessing her with new interest. "And you are?" "Winifred Fletcher. I arrived from Boston to join my brother, only to find his settlement under attack." Something in her educated speech and dignified bearing, despite their circumstances, seemed to register with Beaufort. He studied them all more carefully, his gaze lingering on Miles's obviously injured arm. "A serious accusation," he said finally, "one that would require substantial evidence." Miles reached carefully into his shirt, extracting the golden goblet that had been their insurance against exactly this situation. In the lantern light, it gleamed with unmistakable authenticity, its craftsmanship clearly beyond what common prospectors might possess. Beaufort's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the artifact. Spanish, he murmured, recognizing the style immediately. Colonial period. Part of a larger cache, Nathaniel confirmed, which those men are attempting to claim for themselves through violence. Beaufort seemed to come to a decision. Enter, he said, stepping aside. Though I suggest discretion, your rivals are currently enjoying my hospitality in the main building. They followed Beaufort through the gate into a courtyard surrounded by several structures. The main trading post, a stable, what appeared to be living quarters, and various storage buildings. The trader led them to one of the smaller buildings, ushering them inside what proved to be a private office of sorts, comfortably furnished with a desk, several chairs, and a small stove that provided welcome warmth. Once the door was closed, Beaufort's manner changed subtly, less the cautious trader and more the shrewd businessman assessing a potentially valuable opportunity. Now, he said, gesturing for them to sit, tell me everything. And be assured, if your story proves true, you will have my full support. Over the next hour, they related the complete tale, from Nathaniel and Hargrove's discovery of the map to the attack on Riversbend, their finding of the treasure cave, and the subsequent pursuit. Beaufort listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing them to speak without interruption. He examined the golden goblet carefully, his expertise in trade goods extending to an evident knowledge of historical artifacts. A remarkable find, he acknowledged when they had finished. If the cache is as extensive as you describe, its value would be considerable, not just in raw gold but in historical significance. Then you believe us? Winnie asked directly. Beaufort smiled slightly. Madame, I have been trading in this territory for 15 years. I have developed a certain instinct for distinguishing truth from fabrication. Your account has the ring of authenticity that your rival's story notably lacked. Will you help us contact the territorial authorities? Nathaniel pressed. We need official support to secure the treasure and bring these men to justice. Better than that, Beaufort replied, stroking his beard thoughtfully. The territorial marshal, Jenkins, is currently 2 days east of here, investigating reports of cattle rustling. I can dispatch a rider tonight with a message explaining the situation. With luck, he could intercept the marshal's party and bring them here within 3 days. It was better than they had hoped, though the delay presented its own challenges. What about the raiders in the meantime? Miles asked. Once they realize we're here, they'll either attack or flee back to the cave to secure what they can of the treasure. Beaufort smiled thinly. My trading post employs 15 men, Mr. Xander, all well-armed and experienced in frontier defense. Your raiders, while dangerous, number only 4. They will find no opportunity to harm you while you are under my protection. The confidence was reassuring, though Miles remained wary. Men willing to burn an entire settlement for Spanish gold would not be easily deterred. I suggest you remain in this building for tonight, Beaufort continued. It contains rooms where my more valued guests stay when weather prevents their departure. You can rest, eat, and recover your strength while I arrange matters with the marshal. The prospect of proper shelter, food, and rest was too tempting to refuse, despite Miles's lingering concerns about their safety. Beaufort summoned an assistant who brought hot food, a stew of venison and root vegetables that tasted like ambrosia to their hunger-sharpened palates, and showed them to simple but comfortable rooms upstairs. Before retiring, Miles drew Nathaniel aside. Keep your weapon close, he advised quietly. Beaufort seems trustworthy, but I've learned caution the hard way. Nathaniel nodded in agreement. I'll take first watch just to be safe. We've come too far to be caught unprepared now. With that arrangement in place, they separated to their assigned rooms. Miles found his to be small but well-appointed by frontier standards, a real bed with clean blankets, a washstand with actual soap, and a small window overlooking the courtyard that could serve as an emergency exit if necessary. He cleaned his injured arm thoroughly, relieved to find no signs of serious infection despite its rough treatment. The wound was healing, though it would leave another scar to join the collection accumulated through his years on the frontier. As he prepared for sleep, a soft knock at his door brought him instantly alert, weapon in hand. "Who is it?" he called quietly. "Winnie," came the reply, her voice barely above a whisper. Miles opened the door to find her standing in the darkened hallway, her face shadowed but her posture betraying tension. "Is something wrong?" he asked, instinctively scanning the corridor behind her for threats. "Nothing immediate," she assured him, glancing briefly at the revolver in his hand. "May I come in? There's something I need to discuss." Miles hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of allowing an unmarried woman into his room at night. Yet the circumstances were hardly conventional, and her expression suggested genuine concern rather than any inappropriate intention. "Of course," he said, stepping aside to allow her entry before closing the door quietly behind her. Winnie remained standing, her hands clasped before her in a gesture that seemed unconsciously formal given their surroundings. In the dim light of the single lamp, her face appeared both younger and older than her years, the fine bones of her features highlighted by shadows, her eyes holding knowledge beyond her age. "I've been thinking about what happens after this is resolved," she began without preamble. "Assuming the marshal arrives, the raiders are apprehended and the treasure secured." Miles nodded, uncertain where she was heading with this line of thought. "A lot of assumptions, but reasonable ones. Nathaniel believes we'll receive a substantial reward as the discoverers," she continued. "Enough to rebuild Riversbend properly, to create something lasting on the frontier." "Your brother has vision," Miles acknowledged. "It's admirable." Winnie studied him intently. "And what of your vision, Miles Xander? What do you see for yourself after this adventure concludes?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. In truth, he had avoided considering the future beyond their immediate survival, falling back on the habit of taking life one day at a time. Yet something in Winnie's steady gaze demanded honesty rather than evasion. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "For years, I've lived without planning beyond the next season, the next job. The frontier doesn't encourage long-term thinking." "Doesn't it?" she challenged gently. "The settlers who build homesteads, the merchants who establish trading posts, the communities that put down roots, they're all thinking beyond immediate survival. They're building a future." Miles couldn't argue with her logic, but neither could he easily explain the barriers that had prevented him from embracing such a vision. "Some men aren't meant for putting down roots," he said instead. "The frontier needs its drifters as much as its settlers." Winnie took a step closer, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read truths he kept carefully guarded. "Is that truly what you believe, or is it simply easier than risking disappointment, risking loss again?" The perception behind her question was unsettling, as if she had glimpsed shadows he preferred to keep hidden. Miles found himself unwilling to meet her gaze directly. "You're very direct for a Boston schoolteacher. And you're very evasive for a man who's faced down armed raiders without flinching," she countered, a small smile softening her words. "I apologize if my question makes you uncomfortable. It's just," she hesitated, seeming to search for the right words, "these past days have changed something in me. Facing death, witnessing both the worst and best of what humans are capable of, it clarifies one's thinking." "And what has become clear to you?" Miles asked, genuinely curious about her revelation. Winnie's expression grew thoughtful. "That the frontier is not simply a place of danger and hardship, as I once feared. It's a place of possibility, harsh, yes, but also free from many of the constraints and prejudices of Eastern society. A place where a person might become more truly themselves." It was an unexpectedly philosophical observation from a woman who, just days ago, had appeared the epitome of Eastern refinement. Yet as Miles considered her words, he recognized their truth. The frontier stripped away pretense, confronting each person with their essential nature, for better or worse. It can also be unforgiving, he reminded her gently. Those possibilities come with significant risks. "All meaningful possibilities do," she replied simply. "The question is whether the potential reward justifies the risk." Her gaze held his steadily. "What I'm trying to determine, Mr. Xander, is whether you believe it does." Miles suddenly understood the real question beneath her philosophical musings, one that had more to do with the subtle shift in their relationship than abstract frontier possibilities. The realization both alarmed and exhilarated him. "That's a complex question, Miss Fletcher," he replied carefully, one I'm not sure I have an answer for tonight." Winnie accepted this evasion with grace, though something in her eyes suggested she had expected nothing less. "Fair enough," she said, moving toward the door. "But perhaps consider this: when all is settled with the treasure and the raiders, you'll face a choice about what comes next. I hope you'll choose possibility over certainty, even with its inherent risks." Before Miles could formulate a response to this gentle challenge, she had slipped out the door, leaving him alone with thoughts more turbulent than the river they had crossed in their escape from the raiders. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, turning her words over in his mind. For years, he had embraced the solitary existence of a frontier drifter, convincing himself it was a choice of freedom rather than fear. Yet Winnie Fletcher had somehow seen through that carefully constructed justification to the truth beneath, that his reluctance to form attachments stemmed not from independence, but from the pain of past losses. The realization was uncomfortable, yet strangely liberating. As Miles finally stretched out on the bed, physical exhaustion overtaking mental turmoil, his last coherent thought was that perhaps Winnie was right about the frontier's true nature. Perhaps it was indeed a place of possibility for those brave enough to reach for it. The next morning brought a flurry of activity to the trading post. True to his word, Beaufort had dispatched a rider during the night to intercept the territorial marshal, carrying both a written account of events and the golden goblet as tangible evidence of their claims. Miles woke early, his instinct for self-preservation bringing him to alertness before dawn. He found Nathaniel already awake, keeping watch from a window overlooking the main building where the raiders were staying. The younger man looked haggard but alert, nodding a greeting as Miles joined him. "Any movement?" Miles asked quietly. "Two of them came out about an hour ago, checked on their horses," Nathaniel reported. "They seem restless but not yet suspicious. Beaufort has apparently told them nothing about our arrival." Miles nodded approval. Better they remain ignorant as long as possible. Once they realize we're here with evidence of their crimes, they'll either attack or flee. "Beaufort has men positioned strategically around the compound," Nathaniel added. "He's taking no chances with our safety." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock, followed by Winnie's entrance. She had evidently made use of the washing facilities, her hair neatly arranged and her clothing as presentable as circumstances allowed. If she felt any awkwardness following their conversation the previous night, she showed no sign of it, greeting both men with composed dignity. "Beaufort has invited us to breakfast in his private quarters," she informed them, "away from the main dining area where we might encounter the raiders." The trader's continued discretion was reassuring. They followed Winnie through a connecting passage to Beaufort's personal apartments, a surprisingly comfortable suite of rooms that reflected both frontier practicality and European refinement. The man himself greeted them warmly, ushering them to a table set with a breakfast more elaborate than Miles had seen in years. Fresh bread, preserved fruits, actual coffee, and eggs prepared with herbs. "I trust you slept well?" Beaufort inquired as they seated themselves. "The accommodations are modest by Eastern standards, but I endeavor to provide reasonable comfort." "They were excellent," Winnie assured him. "Far better than we had expected to find so far from civilization." Beaufort smiled, evidently pleased by her appreciation. "The frontier need not be entirely uncivilized, Madame Fletcher. It merely requires individuals willing to maintain certain standards despite the challenges." As they ate, Beaufort outlined his strategy for the coming days. "My messenger should reach Marshal Jenkins by tomorrow evening at the latest. Assuming he responds with appropriate urgency, we can expect his arrival in approximately 3 days." "And the raiders in the meantime?" Miles asked, focusing on the immediate concern. "They believe I am considering a business proposition they have presented, involving mining claims they supposedly control." Beaufort's expression conveyed his skepticism regarding these claims. "This pretext should keep them here for at least another day without arousing suspicion." "And if they discover our presence before the marshal arrives?" Nathaniel pressed. Beaufort's expression hardened slightly. "As I mentioned yesterday, Mr. Fletcher, my establishment is well defended. While I prefer peaceful resolution to conflicts, I am fully prepared to protect my guests if necessary." The trader's confidence was reassuring, though Miles remained wary. Men driven by greed and desperation were unpredictable, potentially willing to take risks that more rational individuals would avoid. After breakfast, they discussed their options for the waiting period ahead. Remaining entirely concealed would be difficult over multiple days, but openly moving about the trading post risked confrontation with the raiders. Beaufort suggested a compromise. They would have access to certain buildings and the rear courtyard, but avoid the main trading floor and front areas where encounters would be most likely. "I have business to conduct with various visitors today," Beaufort explained, "but my assistant, Pierre, will ensure your needs are met. Should anything concerning occur, he will alert you immediately." With that arrangement in place, Beaufort departed for his day's work, leaving them to determine how best to occupy themselves during the enforced wait. Nathaniel decided to review his maps and notes, preparing the documentation they would need when presenting their case to the marshal. Winnie expressed interest in exploring Beaufort's surprisingly extensive library, located in an adjoining room. Miles found himself restless, uncomfortable with inactivity when potential threats lurked nearby. He moved to the window overlooking the main courtyard, studying the layout of the trading post with a strategic eye. If the raiders discovered their presence and attacked, knowing potential escape routes and defensive positions might prove crucial. "You expect trouble," Winnie observed, joining him at the window after selecting several books from Beaufort's collection. "I prepare for it," Miles corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She studied him thoughtfully. "Or is it simply that you've seen enough of the frontier to know that trouble finds those who aren't looking for it?" Miles conceded the point with a slight nod. "Experience teaches caution." "Among other things," she agreed, her gaze returning to the courtyard below where Beaufort's men went about their daily tasks, unloading supplies, repairing equipment, maintaining the small community that the trading post had become. "It's remarkable, isn't it, what can be built even here with sufficient vision and determination?" Miles understood she was referring to more than just the physical structures. Beaufort had created not merely a business but a functioning society in miniature, a place of relative safety and civilization amid the wilderness. It represented exactly the kind of possibility Winnie had spoken of the previous night. "Not everyone has Beaufort's resources or skills," he pointed out, reluctant to be drawn into another philosophical discussion about frontier possibilities. "No," she agreed readily, "but many have other gifts of equal value. The question is whether they choose to employ them in building something lasting or merely surviving from one day to the next." Before Miles could respond to this thinly veiled challenge, a commotion in the courtyard drew their attention. One of the raiders, not the leader with the red bandana, but a heavy-set man with a distinctive limp, had emerged from the main building and was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with one of Beaufort's workers. "That's Jenkins," Nathaniel said, joining them at the window. "One of the men who attacked Riversbend. Looks like he's getting suspicious or impatient." They watched tensely as the confrontation continued, unable to hear the exchange but reading the body language clearly enough. The raider was demanding something, becoming increasingly agitated as the worker apparently refused or deflected his requests. Finally, the worker pointed toward the main trading floor, and Jenkins stomped off in that direction, his dissatisfaction evident in every movement. "They're growing restless," Miles observed grimly. "The longer we wait for the marshal, the greater the chance they'll either discover us or decide to return to the cave without completing whatever business they claim to have with Beaufort." "Could we set a trap?" Nathaniel suggested. "Use ourselves as bait to provoke them into showing their true nature in front of witnesses." Miles shook his head firmly. "Too risky. These men have already demonstrated they're willing to kill. Better to maintain our cover until the marshal arrives." The rest of the day passed in uneasy vigilance, their confinement becoming increasingly frustrating as hours stretched into evening. Beaufort joined them for dinner, reporting that the raiders had indeed grown suspicious, questioning his delay in responding to their supposed business proposition. "I've told them I need another day to consider the potential investment," he explained. "But I don't believe they were convinced. They've been asking questions about recent arrivals, though my staff have maintained our agreed story that no new guests have come since yesterday morning." "You think they suspect we're here?" Nathaniel asked directly. Beaufort considered the question carefully before responding. I believe they are growing concerned about your continued absence. Whether they suspect your specific location is less clear." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "As a precaution, I've doubled the night guards and instructed my men to alert me of any unusual movement." Despite these reassurances, a sense of impending confrontation hung over their evening. They retired early, each retreating to their rooms with weapons close at hand. Miles found sleep elusive, his mind cycling through potential scenarios and responses should the raiders discover their presence before the marshal's arrival. He had finally drifted into a light doze when a soft knock jolted him back to full alertness. Moving silently to the door, weapon ready, he called quietly, "Who is it?" "Pierre," came the hushed response. "Monsieur Beaufort sends urgent word. The raiders are preparing their horses. They appear to be leaving." Miles opened the door to find Beaufort's assistant, a young half-French, half-native man with an expression of controlled urgency. "Now in the middle of the night." Pierre nodded. "They claim a sudden need to return to their camp. Monsieur Beaufort believes they intend to reach the cave and secure the treasure before authorities can arrive." This development forced an immediate decision. If the raiders reached the cave first and removed the treasure, the Fletchers' claims would be significantly weakened, reduced to their word and a single golden goblet against whatever counter-narrative the raiders might construct. "Wake Nathaniel," Miles instructed Pierre. "Tell him what's happening. I'll get Winnie." As Pierre moved to comply, Miles crossed the hallway to Winnie's door, knocking softly but urgently. She responded almost immediately, suggesting she too had been lying awake rather than sleeping. "The raiders are leaving," he explained when she opened the door, already fully dressed as if anticipating trouble. "They're heading back to the cave." Understanding dawned immediately in her eyes. "To take the treasure before the marshal arrives." "Exactly. We need to decide quickly how to respond." Nathaniel joined them moments later, hastily buckling his gun belt. "Beaufort's trying to delay them," he reported, claiming gate protocols require daylight departures for security, but they're insistent. The three exchanged glances, silently considering their limited options. Allowing the raiders to leave meant potentially losing the treasure, the physical evidence that would corroborate their account of events. Yet attempting to stop them directly invited violent confrontation. "We need Beaufort's help," Winnie said decisively. "If he can delay them even an hour while we depart by another route, we might reach the cave first." It was a dangerous gamble, but possibly their only option. They found Beaufort in his office, already coordinating with several of his men. He looked up at their entrance, his expression grave. "You've heard," he said simply. "I'm attempting to slow their departure, but they grow increasingly insistent and suspicious. I fear they may have somehow learned of your presence." "We need to leave immediately," Nathaniel stated without preamble. "Take a different route to the cave, try to reach it before they can remove the treasure." Beaufort frowned, clearly concerned. "A risky proposition. Even if you depart now, they have fresh horses and know the territory. The likelihood of your arriving first is small, and the danger considerable if you encounter them en route." "We have to try," Miles insisted. "Without the treasure as evidence, it becomes our word against theirs." After a moment's consideration, Beaufort nodded. "Very well. I can provide fresh horses and a guide who knows a less direct but potentially faster route to Three Sisters Mountain. And I'll continue delaying the raiders as long as possible without provoking violence." Events moved quickly after this decision. Within 20 minutes, they were mounted on fresh horses at the trading post's rear gate, accompanied by a taciturn native guide Beaufort had summoned from among his workers. The man, introduced only as Hawk by Pierre, wasted no time with pleasantries, spurring his mount into a ground-eating gallop that challenged even the fresh horses to match. They rode through the remainder of the night, a punishing pace that made their previous journey seem like a leisurely amble. Hawk knew the terrain with intimate familiarity, guiding them along narrow ridges and through dense valleys that cut miles off the distance. It was a dangerous ride in the darkness, relying entirely on the sure-footedness of their mounts and the guide's expertise, but the stakes demanded nothing less. Dawn found them exhausted but ahead of their quarry. Three Sisters Mountain rose before them, its peaks bathed in the rose-gold light of sunrise. Hawk led them not to the base where they had left their original horses, but to a higher vantage point that overlooked the approach to the waterfall. "They are not here yet," the guide said, his first words of the journey. He pointed to the trail below. "But they are coming, dust in the valley." Miles strained to see, spotting the faint haze that marked the raiders' approach. They were perhaps an hour behind, close enough to be dangerous but distant enough to allow preparation. "We need to hold the entrance," Miles said, assessing the tactical situation. "If they get inside the cave, we'll never dig them out without destroying the treasure." They scrambled up to the ledge, the roar of the waterfall masking the sound of their movements. The cave entrance remained as they had left it, the dark maw concealing centuries of secrets. "We have the high ground," Nathaniel noted, taking a position behind a rock outcropping that offered a clear line of fire to the approach. "And the element of surprise." "We use it to stall," Winnie insisted, checking the load in the rifle Beaufort had lent her. "The marshal is our goal, we just need to keep them out until help arrives." The hour of waiting stretched their nerves thin. Miles checked his weapon repeatedly, though he knew it was ready. He stood near Winnie, his shoulder brushing hers in the confined space of the ledge. "You should be back in the cave," he told her quietly. "It's safer." "I'm not leaving you," she replied, her eyes fixed on the trail below. "We started this together, we finish it together." The raiders appeared soon after, moving with the haste of men who knew they were racing against time. There were 4 of them now, the 3 from the previous encounter plus the heavyset man, Jenkins, they had seen at the trading post. They rode straight for the base of the falls, clearly intending to secure the site immediately. "Hold fire until they dismount," Miles whispered. "Let them think they're unopposed." They watched as the men reached the pool, arguing loudly about the best way to access the ledge. The surviving leader, a scarred man who had taken command after Red Bandana's death, pointed up toward the cave mouth. "Get up there," he shouted, "and keep your eyes open. They might still be in the area." As 2 of the men began to navigate the slippery path behind the falls, Miles stepped out from cover, leveling his rifle. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice booming over the roar of the water. The raiders froze, looking up in shock. The leader's hand moved instantly to his gun. "Don't," Miles warned. "You're covered, drop the weapons and back away." "It's the Cowboy," one of the men shouted. "And Fletcher." "Kill them," the leader roared, diving behind a boulder as he drew his weapon. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Bullets chipped stone from the ledge, forcing Miles and the Fletchers back into cover. They returned fire sparingly, focused on keeping the raiders pinned down rather than killing them. The narrow approach worked in their favor. Only 1 man could advance at a time, and doing so under fire was suicide. The standoff dragged on for what felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocks. The raiders tried twice to rush the ledge, only to be driven back by accurate fire from Nathaniel and Miles. Winnie proved her worth as well, spotting a flanker trying to scale the cliff face from the other side and alerting Miles in time to stop him. But their ammunition was limited, and the raiders were growing desperate. "They're getting ready for a big push," Miles observed, watching them gather near the base of the trail. "They know they're running out of time." "So are we," Nathaniel said, checking his cartridge belt. "I'm down to 5 rounds." "I have 3, Winnie added grimly. Miles looked at them, the battered prospector and the schoolteacher who had become a warrior. He felt a fierce swell of pride and something deeper. "If they breach the ledge," he said quietly, "retreat into the cave. There are choke points inside we can hold with rocks if necessary." "And leave you?" Winnie asked, her voice sharp. "I'll hold the entrance." "No," she said, reaching out to grip his hand. "We hold it together, or not at all." Before Miles could argue, a new sound cut through the noise of the waterfall, a bugle call, clear and commanding. The raiders faltered, looking back down the valley. Thunderous hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. A column of riders burst into view, dust streaming behind them. At the lead rode a man with a tin star pinned to his chest, Marshal Jenkins, accompanied by Beaufort and a dozen deputies. "Federal marshals," the cry went up. "Throw down your arms." The raiders, caught between the high ground and the law, hesitated only a moment before dropping their weapons. The fight went out of them as quickly as it had begun, the reality of their situation crashing down. Miles slumped against the rock wall, the adrenaline draining away to leave him shaking. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Winnie, her face streaked with dirt and gunpowder, tears standing in her eyes. "We did it," she whispered. "We did," he agreed, pulling her into a fierce embrace that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with survival. The recovery of the Spanish treasure made headlines as far east as New York. It was, as Nathaniel had predicted, a find of immense historical and monetary value. The territorial government claimed a portion, but the reward granted to the discoverers was substantial, enough to ensure that neither Nathaniel nor Winnie would ever want for anything again. But it was what they did with it that changed the territory. Instead of taking the money back east, the Fletchers reinvested it in Riversbend. They rebuilt the settlement not as a rough mining camp, but as a proper town. They built a schoolhouse with glass windows and a library filled with books Winnie ordered from Boston. They funded a clinic and hired a doctor. They built a town hall where justice could be administered fairly. Miles watched it all unfold over the next year. He had stayed, initially to help with the rebuilding, telling himself he would move on once the work was done. But weeks turned into months, and the urge to drift never returned. One evening in late autumn, he found Winnie in the unfinished frame of the new schoolhouse. She was looking out at the valley, where the lights of the growing town twinkled in the twilight. "It's changing," she said without turning, knowing his step. "The frontier, it's not just about surviving anymore." "No," Miles agreed, moving to stand beside her. "It's about living." He looked at the town below, then at the woman beside him. He thought of the solitary man who had waited for a train a year ago, convinced that attachment was a weakness. He realized now that he had been wrong. The frontier didn't demand solitude. It demanded partners strong enough to build something that could withstand the storm. "I've been thinking," he said, his heart hammering harder than it had during the gunfight. "The town needs a sheriff. Donovan is retiring, and the council asked if I'd take the badge." Winnie turned to him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I'd have to ask my wife first." Winnie's breath caught. "And do you have a wife, Mr. Xander?" "Not yet," he said, taking her hands in his. "But I'm hoping to convince a very stubborn, very brave schoolteacher that I'm worth the risk." He went down on one knee on the sawdust-covered floor. "I don't have a title, Winnie. And I'm still learning how to be a man who stays. But I promise you I will never leave you stranded again. Will you marry me?" Winnie looked down at him, her green eyes shining with the same light that had guided them through the darkness of the mountains. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Miles, I will." 5 years later, the train made its scheduled stop at the bustling station of Riversbend. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle stepped onto the platform, notebook in hand. He had come to write a story about the model town of the West, a place that had risen from ashes to become a beacon of civilization on the frontier. He approached a tall man with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest, who was waiting on the platform with a young boy perched on his shoulders. "Sheriff Xander," the reporter asked, "I'm told you're the man who tamed this territory." Miles laughed, a deep, rich sound. He looked toward the schoolhouse, where a woman with honey-blonde hair was dismissing her class, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach as she waved to them. "I didn't tame anything, son," Miles replied, smiling at his wife. "I just found something worth protecting." He turned back to the train, no longer a man waiting for nothing, but a man who had everything. The frontier had changed, yes, but so had he. And looking at the town they had built and the family they had created, Miles knew that the greatest treasure hadn't been the gold in the cave, but the love that had given them the courage to claim it.